Your name is Peter Robert Garrett.
That's right.
You've provided a statement to this Commission dated the 8th of May 2014. Are there any matters in that statement that you wish to correct?
I'll just seek Council's advice. I think there's a couple of typos we have in there, Council assisting, so whether they get corrected now or at a later date.
They can be advised to the Commission. But apart from those, there's no other corrections that you wish to make to your statement?
That's correct.
Thank you. Did you want to raise your hand?
Commissioner, could I hand up a document which has been provided to those assisting the Commission and which is on the data room for the assistance of my learned friends behind, and it just identifies particular paragraphs in the statement of Mr Garrett and in annexures thereto which the Commonwealth submits attract parliamentary privilege, and I've raised it with both Council assisting and with Mr Whitlam, who represents Mr Garrett, and each of those council is willing to proceed on the basis that the material can, as it were, stay in the document, but will not be relied on for any tendentious purpose, and therefore Section 16(3) of the Parliamentary Privileges Act isn't offended, and we're content with that course. But we thought the Commission...
if that's acceptable to everybody. So these, unlike other cases, these bits aren't redacted in fact.
They're not redacted. In fact, they do appear there, and my learned friends at the bar table behind ought bear the paragraph numbers and the annexures in mind so as not to purport to cross-examine upon them because they simply can't be relied upon.
And what about the statement going up on the web and so on?
We're content. We don't think logistically it's worth engaging in a redaction exercise. We're content to proceed on this basis.
These redactions haven't been... There's been nothing in it, really, has there? I mean, I know the point's got to be taken, but there's been nothing terribly interesting in them, has there?
Not so far as we were concerned, but more importantly, neither Council assisting nor the witness himself is seeking to have that material relied upon.
Thank you. Yes, Mr Wilson.
And there's no issue, Commissioner, so far as the Commission is concerned with the redactions that have been made on the basis of public interest immunity to the statement and the annexures to that statement.
Thank you for that.
And I don't think counsel for the witness has any point with that.
We don't want to canvass the redaction that's gone on. We've tendered a statement. These are what the Commonwealth wants removed and accept.
Thanks, Mr Wilson.
And indeed, may I say, just on this point, the public interest immunity could arise orally, in which case my client is as anxious as anybody to defend the proper claim for it.
Quite so.
Thank you.
Before Mr Wilson commences, having just taken a note, for example, 142 of Mr Garrett's statement.
Yeah.
So I take it that the redaction is meant to be in the middle of it on 11th February, that is the question, rather than the first two paragraphs?
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Have a moment to have a look at the rest, as it was only on the screen for a couple of minutes.
You're happy to proceed though, Mr Perry?
Yes, for the moment.
Thank you.
Do you have a copy of your statement with you, Mr Garrett?
I do.
Can I take you first to paragraph 9? And I just want you to explain to the Commission the means by which, first, the Department gave advice to you. Do I understand that that was either by a formal brief, by way of a discussion with the Departmental Secretary or officers of the Department? Were there any other ways that you received advice from the Department?
The general practice was that following discussions, either with the Secretary or senior staff, and also following discussions between my office and other officers of the Department, a formal brief would come up to me for consideration. And it was on that basis, on the basis of the briefs, that I made the decisions or annotated or sent the brief back, as the case may be.
Now, looking at the other side of the equation, the circumstances in which you sought advice from the department? How would that be done?
Well, it would come about either as a consequence of receiving a brief and either annotating the brief or alternatively saying to either the advisor or chief of staff there's a query or a question or more information required. It may be on the basis of material that was provided by way of proposals for certain things. So, for example, if you were developing policy, there may be some proposals that came in front of you in draft form. It may arise at the meetings that were had with department officials and the meetings that I would have over time with the secretary. And of course, once the program was in train, such as the HIP program, then any meetings that would take place as a consequence.
And can I take you then to paragraph 10 of your statement? I just wanted you to explain, in paragraph 10A, you say that issues in relation to safety were addressed by me and or the department in the following ways: the creation of a first national register of installers. How that addressed issues of safety?
Well, the issue of the Commonwealth's regulatory role in respect of the insulation industry had been canvassed in preliminary discussions, as the Commission would be aware. And it was the advice from the department that the way in which to effectively ensure line of sight with the delivery of the program was for installers to actually be registered on a registry. And on that basis, compliance matters and other things could be properly determined.
It's more the setting of the conditions for entry on the register that may address matters of safety rather than the mere existence of the register, isn't it?
Look, that's correct, but it was through the mechanism of the register that it was determined that that could happen.
You say in subparagraph B, a nationally accredited training scheme which applied for the first time. Now, you became aware at some stage that training was not mandatory for persons working under the scheme other than holding, I'll use the term white card, but it's different colours in different states apparently. Other than having an OH&S white card, there was no mandatory training for people working as employees or subcontractors, provided they were supervised. Is that your understanding, as in from that 8 May?
That's correct.
So the nationally accredited training scheme, do you say, was there if people wish to take advantage of it?
That's right.
In paragraph 10C, you say there was a requirement for installers to observe a set of standards higher than the Australian standards and the building code. I'm wondering what you're referring to there. What were the standards that were set that were higher than those two documents?
Well, I'm thinking about something, although it comes, I think, subsequent to this particular date, to, say, for example, the provision of the mandatory inclusion of downlight covers.
Yes. Anything else?
Off the top of my head, no, but I'm happy to consider it.
And in paragraph D, you say that all reports of safety breaches, etc. Were you aware of any reports of safety breaches being made to the department prior to Mr Fuller's death on the 14th of October 2009?
Safety breaches?
Yes.
I'd have to go to the briefs again to see whether raised in the briefs there were things which might be described as safety breaches. So in those terms, off the top of my head, no, I can't think of anything.
Would you expect to have been told about those sort of things, or for them to be dealt with at a departmental level?
I think it would depend on the nature of the safety breach. If it was a serious safety breach, and clearly
a fatality is. But what about people receiving electric shocks during the course of their work? Would you expect something like that to be escalated to you?
Again, well, someone receiving electric shock, I would imagine that in time, whether it was straight away or in the course of the next day or two, that would be communicated to me.
Paragraph 12 you say that there were installers who didn't comply with the guidelines, etc. Can I suggest to you and seek your comment that that was something that was foreseeable for this reason, that one of the main concerns we've seen in the documents is a concern about fraud or seeking to gain a dishonest benefit under the scheme. Wasn't it plainly foreseeable that those sort of people who'd be working under the scheme also might be the same sort of people who wouldn't comply with OH&S requirements?
Well, I think I've said in a public interview, which is subsequent, I think, to the dates in question, that asked about one of the things which did give me cause for surprise, it was that there were a larger number of installers than I would have expected who didn't observe the requirements of the scheme, whether it relates to OH&S or fraud.
When did that become a concern in your mind?
I think towards the end of August coming into September is probably about the right timeline. I know I seek additional feedback on an audit and compliance brief that I received, which indicated to me that as the numbers in the program started to increase, there may be a likelihood that we'd see increasing incidences that were reported. But I think probably up until Matthew Fuller's death, there was an awareness of that. And then at a later time, obviously, the safety issues themselves also were considered of importance.
Was the concern prior to 14 October, and that's the date of Mr Fuller's death, primarily concerned with fraud?
I wouldn't characterise it like that, Council. I think, as you know, there was a series of deliberations both between officers and departments to establish the scheme. It has a number of phases. Risk assessment was identified as being one of the component processes that took place, as was audit and compliance, and also the training component, and consequent to that, an expectation that, to some extent, a regulatory framework that didn't exist at the Commonwealth level was still in existence at the state level, and that safety matters would fall within its remit.
I was more focusing on whether there was a consciousness on your part of there being safety concerns between 1 July and 14 October.
I think as we get towards the 14 October date, which we're referring to now, it was clear that there were sufficient incidences starting to emerge in the program that the compliance framework would need to be looked at, and that out of that there may be safety issues that arose.
What issues were coming to your attention that led you to that statement?
I think the issue of whether or not installation was installed in such a way as might prevent fire, I think is the obvious one.
And there'd already been some reports of house fires.
That's correct.
Coming through to the department. What about the specific matter of injury to installers?
Injury to installers isn't, from my recollection and from the briefs that we have here in preparing this statement, raised directly with me by way of a decision-making or otherwise. And I think up until Matthew Fuller's death, it wasn't something which had been specifically or formally brought to my attention.
And we spoke about the means of giving and taking advice. Do you recall, if it's not in a brief, if it's in a brief, we can go to the brief and
Yes.
read it. Do you recall seeking any advice from the department about whether the program was performing in such a way that there was no or limited concern about people being injured in carrying out insulation work?
I don't recall specifically seeking advice in written form. Whether it was a matter that was raised directly by me in meetings with officials and at what time, I can't recall. My expectation is that I would have raised a matter had I been aware of it specifically, and perhaps put a question or sought some additional advice.
I take you to paragraph 17 of your statement and the second sentence. I take it that the language there suggests that it was not the Prime Minister personally who contacted you personally, but rather a respective officer in his office contacting an officer in your office. Is that right?
That's right.
How did that come to your attention?
Well, there's a lot of interactions between advisors across offices, including from the Prime Minister's office to my office. And as it had been the case that we were looking at the issue of energy efficiency more broadly, and there were specific advisors designated to those roles, whatever they were working on at that time in terms of the micro detail, or alternatively, or what other suggestions would have been communicated to me on a basis, whether it was regular or otherwise, I couldn't say.
Are you able to put that in time?
Well, I think it's more likely to be towards the end of the time period we have there than early.
Do you recall Mr. Levy, who was an advisor of yours at the time, informing you that the Prime Minister wanted a big idea on energy efficiency?
Well, I think I was aware that there was a call for policy ideas, which we might want to describe as big ideas. That's something which was important business for us to consider in terms of energy efficiency and rolling out strong energy efficiency programs.
Because a considerable amount of work had been done during calendar year 2008 and on energy efficiency measures and the link into the carbon pollution reduction scheme, I think it was called. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Was the idea was it your understanding that at this time it was a request for an energy efficiency measure which would have a stimulus effect?
In the initial instance of considering energy efficiency policy, no, it wasn't in respect of seeking a fiscal stimulus policy to partner it, as it were, or to go with it, I should say.
I'm talking here about the Prime Minister contacting your office requesting development of the energy efficiency policy. That sentence, was that with a stimulatory effect?
Well, you're referring to me to something that Mr. Levy said. I don't recall.
I'm referring to your statement, the second sentence of paragraph 17, requesting development of the energy efficiency policy.
Oh, I see what you mean, yeah. No, that's really well, my understanding of what I've said there, my intention in what I have here is to say that this was something which we've been working on already. Departments and the Minister's offices and the Prime Minister's office would have been aware of that. It was within my remit.
And work was also being done within a task force located within Prime Minister and Cabinet?
That's right.
At the same time?
Well, I'm not sure exactly of the time, but there was work undertaken by a task force. Yeah.
Do you recall either being contacted yourself, and I'm speaking here, and when I ask you all these questions, I'm speaking outside of the Cabinet room?
All outside of the Cabinet room?
Yes. Being contacted by the Prime Minister and asked for your department to do some work on a policy which also had a stimulatory effect?
In my recollection of conversations with Mr. Rudd concerning this matter, we certainly did have a conversation about working up something which was an energy efficiency policy, which had sort of significant outreach, I guess is the way I would describe it.
When did that happen?
My recollection is we had a discussion in January. I think I have January 19. And we may have spoken about that at an earlier time as well.
And I'll come to the costings work that was done perhaps in the course of the statement. Were you informed prior to the Australia Day weekend that two officers of the department were doing work at the request of Prime Minister and Cabinet?
Not specifically, no.
Do did you become aware after that weekend and before the 3rd of February that they'd been asked to do so?
That's correct.
When did you become aware that the policy, which was initially known as the Energy Efficient Homes Package, announced on 3 February, was going to be announced?
Sometime before the announcement date, and in as much as I can recall, through a series of conversations that emerged between my advisors, my office and the Prime Minister's office.
Now, what detail were you given about the policy that was going to be announced on the 3rd of February?
I was given detail about the content of the policy, what it was intended to achieve, and obviously the role that we'd play.
Now, at that time, did you cause any inquiries to be made as to whether your department had the capacity and or the capability, perhaps deal with them separately, to handle a program of this magnitude?
At that time?
Before the 3rd of February?
No.
Why not?
Because it would be my view that the decision of a government to embark on a policy is something which department, or departments plural, would need to organise themselves to give effect to. And I had no reason to believe that it was outside of the remit of government or the capacity of government for that to happen.
Can I ask you two questions about that? The first is, to your recollection, was your department handling a large volume of work in the first half of 2009, in the second half of 2008?
Well,
working to about capacity.
I think notwithstanding the current debate that we're seeing outside of this Commission, Council, I think that my experience was that our departments pretty much work to capacity.
And this program, which was announced on the 3rd of February, was a very large program.
Yes, that's right.
A lot of, and I fully appreciate, please, when I ask these questions, I appreciate that it's a $42 billion package spread over a number of portfolios.
I was, yes.
But I'm only focusing on one aspect of it. Even so, that aspect of it was a very large project involving some $3 or $4 billion.
Well, in as much as governments and departments, although not always the Environment Department, deliver large projects, and they certainly deliver projects that have got sums greater than $2 billion attached to them.
Fully appreciate that.
It was within the capacity of government to deliver a program of that kind.
But the Environment Department was more of a policy department rather than a program delivery department, wasn't it?
That's correct.
I just want to understand why it wouldn't have been an appropriate inquiry to make before the policy is announced as to whether the department has A, the capacity, and B, the capability of carrying out the task.
Well, perhaps I can best answer that question by saying that some of the complexity in policy formulation that we'd already undertaken in relation to energy efficiency was going to require some significant changes to the way in which policy was delivered into the community. And for example, I'm thinking about things like energy assessments, looking at the energy mix that people could arguably, if they had government support, apply in their own homes. And that policy work, which was work that had been undertaken by the department, was detailed and to some extent complex. But if it was concluded satisfactorily, then something which was, in a sense, less complicated than that, didn't raise a question mark in my mind at that time about the capacity or otherwise of departments to deliver the program.
But did I understand that no inquiry was made to see whether that was in fact the case?
Well, you're asking me about that specific time. Certainly there would have been a discussion subsequent to that decision to determine how.
But once it's announced, there's then embarrassment concerned if it has to be resolved from, whereas before it's publicly announced, I would have thought an inquiry could be made of the department if they said, look, we've got our hands full, we just can't handle this.
Well, I guess with respect, Council, I've got to say that embarrassment doesn't come into it. It is a question of the advice that you receive from the department as to how they are going to give effect to that policy satisfactorily. And it may be that they determine that they'll work in partnership perhaps with another department. It may be that they have to bring additional resources and have additional personnel to come and give effect to it. It may be that they consider working with a private partner. I mean, there are many permutations that can arise from a decision of that kind, and that is, I guess, in the normal course of government considering these issues and working out how to respond to them, that would happen, and certainly that was my expectation.
I'm really just exploring why the department wasn't given the opportunity of considering those matters before the program was given to it.
Well, I don't have access to all of the information and material that's went between the department and the work that was done over the Australia Day weekend et al. All I can say is that in terms of advices that came to me, I didn't have a view when the advice reached me that it wouldn't be possible to deliver a home insulation program.
Can I take you then to paragraph 21 of your statement? And this is on a different topic. I just wanted to clarify your understanding. I fully appreciate you have ministerial responsibility for the HIP, but in distinguishing between your role as the responsible minister and then Senator Arbib's role as effectively some sort of conduit with reporting lines to the Office of Coordinator General, can you just explain that to the Commission?
Well, Senator Arbib's role was a coordination role when it was formalised, with a view to both projecting and ensuring that the maximum benefit of the stimulus was felt, particularly in employment terms. And this was one of the programs that was aimed to deliver that result. So to that extent, there's a relationship between the two offices. And as you say, the policy approval component of it and the ultimate delivery responsibilities were those of the department. But there's a working group that's established, and Senator Arbib sits on that working group with the Coordinator General. And they're essentially, from my perspective, overseeing and understanding the way in which the policy is actually being delivered and interacting at that level.
Now, you're responsible for the HIP, and there are a number of elements to the stimulus package, as we know, which Senator Arbib is dealing with. But did you have a meeting at the outset and clarify roles?
We spoke, as mentioned in the statement, and there was a question about whether there ought to be a clarification of roles or not. And I came to the view ultimately that didn't need to be written down on paper. That we can continue to do our work with our respective responsibilities.
Now, in paragraph 22, and this might be a matter of language, but in paragraph 22 you say in the second sentence, I recall Senator Arbib being involved in some decisions, etc. And you can read the rest of that for yourself. I'm just trying to understand that in the sense of Senator Arbib couldn't make a decision as a responsible minister.
No, I think you're right to query the language that's used. I'm thinking about the discussions that we had about the possibility of having regional delivery of energy efficiency. As you'll know from my statement and maybe from other witnesses, I was always pretty focused on what the impact would be on low-income households and how we might get energy efficiency out to low-income households. So those discussions would take place either between officers or in this group. People would know what one's views were, but in terms of formal decision-making, the formal decision-making is recorded in the briefs in terms of the delivery of the program by DEWA, which I had to sign off on.
Can you think of any circumstances in which either Senator Arbib on his own, or Senator Arbib with the assistance of the Office of Coordinator General, came to you with a, if not calling it a decision, a proposal which you then subsequently adopted. That is, they've done all the work and you were just asked to sign off on it.
Well, I think the fact is that a lot of work was done on the ultimate shape of the HIP, which wasn't done, as it were, by the department. It relied on costings work and other research work that had been done by the department, but it was effectively done outside of the department with my department officials doing that work, and that decision itself falls into that category.
What are you referring to there?
The decision that was taken to finally roll out the implementation of insulation at this level.
So what, the delivery model, is that what you're speaking about? Or
No, I'm talking about when we went from looking at energy efficiency, how it might be rolled out, to the beginnings of the announcement that was made on Feb 3 through the different phases to the end of the program.
That was a decision of government.
Correct.
But then once the program's been announced, there's a number of decisions that have to be made along the way. And we've seen briefs where you've approved or recommended certain courses of action. I was really inquiring as to whether there are any circumstances you can think of where that work's been done effectively by the OCG with the assistance of Senator Arbib, or Senator Arbib on his own has come to you and said, we'd like to do it this way, and you've signed off on that.
I think from there's one brief in here which refers to me sending an advice across to Senator Arbib. I don't have any recollection of any other matters that were formally presented to me, and other than the discussions that I had, perhaps one or two discussions in the early phases of the program with Senator Arbib about the program generally and the regional issues I've spoken about, and us reaching an agreement that this is where we were heading, then the answer to your question is no.
We've heard a lot of evidence about the 1st of July start date for phase 2 of the program, the main rollout. That was announced by the Prime Minister on the 3rd of February. Was it ever explained to you the significance of the date of the 1st of July, or was it just an arbitrary date being the start of a financial year?
The latter, in as much as it's not referred to specifically in any briefs, and I don't recall any specific advice or discussions about that date, other than a notification, I think, in one of the briefs in the intervening period between February and July, that it would be challenging.
I've heard that word a lot.
You would have.
But do I understand you to say that had you held concerns that the program could not be rolled out to your satisfaction on the 1st of July, that it was within your remit to put that date back?
Well,
Would you have to go to the Prime Minister or Cabinet?
That's a big hypothetical question, and addressing it would seem you're sort of talking at great length about decision making and what may or may not have happened. I think, if I understand what it is you're asking me, then my view was always that the government had determined a course of action. It was a decision that was made by the government as a whole, and it was our job to do it the best that we could to make sure that it happened.
We've seen subsequent letters where you've written to the Prime Minister and he's responded, changing things like the two-quote requirement. Would that sort of correspondence have been necessary to move the date from, say, 1 July to 1 August?
It would have required discussion with the Prime Minister's office. All of these policy changes or guidelines do, and in some cases, as you know from my statement and from other evidence you would have heard, policy authority would need to be sought from the Prime Minister, and perhaps discussions and decision making by within the cabinet envelope, so to speak. If you're also asking me, Council, whether or not, if I had have received advice that the department could not in any way fulfil the policy remit that had been determined by government, whether I could have then changed the date or altered the date or refused to sign something. Well, it would have depended on the nature of the advice. It would have depended on when it was received. And I'm not proposing to spend a great deal of time. Obviously, I'll answer all yours and other council's questions on these sorts of hypotheticals, other than to say it's always ultimately determined by the minister, but also the minister in consultation with colleagues, the cabinet and relevant committees.
Was it ever explained to the department by you or by your office that although the date of the 1st of July is the announced date, that if the department had concerns that the program could not be rolled out on that date, that they should come back to you and seek an extension?
Not that I can recall.
Because you see, the department may be working on the view that 1 July is an immutable date, not knowing that all they have to do is persuade you to move it. I'm just wondering how they would know that without somebody telling them.
Well, it's not out of the ordinary for departmental officials at that level to bring advice and to test advice even with their ministers on a range of matters, including the sort of hypothetical that you've described.
Now, in paragraph 23 of your statement, you say PMNC, through the Office of Coordinator General, and Senator Arbib played a role in shaping and approving the rollout of the HIP. Now, can I deal with the second identified person first? What role did Senator Arbib play in shaping and approving the rollout of the HIP?
Well, I can't provide you with a specific instance of the HIP in its final form that he specifically did. So that's a way of describing the policy formulation process that was undertaken to get the HIP underway.
What about the Office of Coordinator General? Can you give an example of that?
Well, we can see in relation to the Office of Coordinator General's participation in determining the training requirements that it had the effect of shaping the rollout in some respect.
So that's one example you can think of.
Yes.
Did you have any interaction with Mr Murdoch?
No.
Weekly reports we know were provided by the department to the Office of Coordinator General. I think you say they were also supplied to you?
I understand that those weekly reports came through to our office, but they weren't attached to briefs that came to me, and I've asked myself this question before coming. I can't recall seeing them on a regular basis. If I saw any in the early phase at all or not, I can't say.
There were also other reports, and I'm interested in whether they came to your office. When I say to you, I mean to your office as well.
Correct, yeah.
There were reports by the Office of Coordinator General to Senator Arbib. Do you recall being copied in on copies of those?
No.
And we've heard some evidence that there were also reports by the Office of Coordinator General to the Prime Minister. Were you copied in on those?
Not to my recollection.
I take you then to paragraphs 31 to 33 of your statement. If at any time you want to stop me and just reread things, please tell me, but I assume you've read this before.
I have.
Evidence. Did anyone advise you during the discussions you refer to in those paragraphs of any concerns that the department had as to, first, any safety risks associated with the program?
Are we referring to paragraph 31 and
31,
then 32,
2 and 3.
And then 3? Not to my recollection, no.
About any concerns as to the types of products that were being permitted to be used under the program?
Not other than that which is dealt with in the formal briefing process and which was I think, represented to us at a later meeting of the industry.
Any concerns about issues surrounding training or competency of people to work under the program?
Well, that issues were addressed around training and competency, but if you're talking about
During these
red light concerns, well, I don't recall having a discussion with the Secretary about that matter. We may have had one, but I can't recall if we did.
What about timing?
I think it was understood that timing was always a critical element in the rollout of this program.
Did the Secretary ever say words which led you to believe that there was a concern as to whether it would be ready to roll out on the 1st of July?
I didn't ever receive any formal advice from the Secretary to that effect.
What about informal advice?
Well, if that had been put to me sufficiently strongly, then I would have required that it come to me by way of a formal brief. As I think I've explained in my statement, I dealt with formal briefing as a way of making decisions.
Yes.
That's how you have a record of them. So the answer's not to my knowledge, no.
Now, could I take you then to paragraph 34? You say tantalisingly in the first sentence, I had a conversation with the Prime Minister, and leave it at that. What was the conversation about?
Well, I don't recall the detail of the conversation. As I said before, I had a number of conversations with the Prime Minister over time, and various matters had been canvassed, but in this instance it is a conversation about what kind of policies can we deliver as a government around in the energy efficiency space.
Is it the limit of your recollection that in the conversation the Prime Minister asked for, and then what you've described as instructing Mr Levy to do?
Well, I think this has come about as a consequence of Mr Levy's early evidence to you, which has been noted by my solicitors, and if the wording is slightly incorrect, it's not sufficiently incorrect to remove it of meaning.
I'll come back to various aspects, but just since you've touched on it, are there any aspects of Mr Levy's evidence with which you disagree?
I haven't read it in detail. I sought not to effectively taint myself with the evidence of many others that were
I just thought I'd ask why you mentioned his evidence.
So there's a couple of things there that I might have described differently from recollection, but if I get something put to you, I'll respond to it.
Yes. Paragraph 43 of your statement. And can I bring up on the screen AGS 002 017 0161, please? You can just go to the end, to attachment A, I should say. Attachment A. No, it'll be down towards the bottom. There we have it. Keep going. Keep going. Now, I think if you want to scroll back up through the attendance list, I don't think Mr Levy's at this meeting. And I'm just wondering how... You see in the fourth line of your paragraph 43, you say, I was informed by Mr Matt Levy that the meeting heard a proposal, etc.
I think that falls...
How he knew?
Well, I think the answer falls within the frame of the same answer I gave you to the previous question.
And do you recall him telling you that he had a copy of the minutes of the meeting?
No.
Do you recall ever seeing the minutes of the meeting?
No.
Before I've just shown them to you?
Correct.
You might have seen them in the course of preparation. Can we just bring those minutes up again? I'm sure you've looked at this part before. Can we go to page 5? Fourth dot point, third, last 3 lines, Peter Roos provided an example. Now, you weren't given a copy of the minutes. Were you told that information?
No, I wasn't.
When did you first become aware of that information?
Well, very recently. I think when Mr. Roos's comments became public following one of the fatalities, my recollection is it was raised at that point in time, but actually not until such time as the Commission started examining this matter was I fully appraised of them.
When the first fatality occurred, you would have then been seeking to acquaint yourself with as much information as to what the department knew and when?
Correct.
But were these minutes not given to you at that stage?
I certainly don't recall receiving them.
Do you consider that that was an important piece of information?
Yes.
Sitting there now, do you consider that as information that you should have been informed of in February 2009?
Yes, I do.
Were you aware, as at 18 or 19 February 2009, this meeting's on the 18th, that New Zealand had a program where it effectively offered a rebate to people installing insulation?
No, I wasn't.
Did you become aware during the first half of 2009 that the New Zealand government was proposing launching its own insulation program on 1 July 2009?
No, I don't. Well, not that I can recall. Someone may have mentioned it to me, but I honestly have no memory of it.
I think you mentioned in your statement that you visited New Zealand in
Correct.
2008.
Yes.
And you inspected a house, or you went to a house that had insulation installed, is that right?
Correct.
And that was part of a low-income scheme?
That was, as I understood it, part of a scheme where the local health department was providing insulation for low-income properties or properties that were occupied by elderly people.
So they didn't get influenza?
Yeah, as I stated in the statement.
Yes. Did you have any discussion with the New Zealand officials while you were there about how's the program going? Have you had any problems, matters of that sort?
No, I was in New Zealand for other purposes. I did give a speech around the broad areas of sustainability, I think on the morning that I then went to visit this particular house in a suburb in Auckland. But I was also there to discuss issue. Australia and New Zealand had joint positions on the question of alleged or so-called scientific whaling.
Yes.
And my discussions were there with the Foreign Minister, Environment Minister and others about that issue as well.
Did you return to New Zealand during the currency of the HIP?
No. Just say the question again, Councillor.
Did you return to New Zealand during the currency of the HIP?
I go back to New Zealand, I think, on one other occasion. Well, I'd have to check. I don't think so.
Let me ask more specifically. Do you recall, if you did return to New Zealand in that period, having anything to do with insulation?
I'm searching my memory now, and I'm reasonably confident that I didn't, and I certainly didn't hear anything about New Zealand's insulation program that I can remember.
This is jumping ahead quite a deal, but do you recall that the New Zealanders came to Australia in early November 2009 and made a presentation to the Department of Environment staff about their program?
Well, I now know that, but I didn't at the time, or I wasn't aware of it at the time.
So there was no, if you like, meet and greet or introduction of yourself to the New Zealand people?
Not that I can recall.
In that same paragraph, and I just ask you to perhaps keep this in the back of your mind. You see the last sentence in that same paragraph, the majority strongly recommended?
I do.
Do you recall whether that information was passed on to you?
My statement refers to the fact that Matt Levy had raised it consequent to the meeting, and I don't either remember that clearly happening or not happening, but he may well have. And certainly I was aware of the training discussions more broadly.
Yes, but the piece of information I'm asking about is that industry representatives had discussed the topic and had strongly recommended mandatory training for insulation installers.
Well, you've added the word strongly recommended here.
Well, that's in the minute.
That's right. But it's not in my statement, and in reading the statement it may have been something which was mentioned, and it's not in accord with what I recall, but I certainly don't recall a specific representation from Mr Levy or anybody else at that early stage about the fact that it was raised and strongly recommended at this meeting.
Again, this is jumping ahead a little, but do you recall when the brief was sent to you to approve the installer competencies in May, which removed the requirement for mandatory training of installers, thinking Matt Levy told me something about this in February?
No, I actually don't have that recollection.
Paragraph 49 of your statement. Did you receive any technical advice or any advice from the department which went through the various products, insulation products, that it was envisaged would be used under the program and, in a sense, give you the pros and cons?
Only in as much as the information that was included in the brief referred to those matters.
Do you recall seeing any reports from what I call experts?
Not at this point in time, no.
Paragraph 51. You say in the fourth line, the purpose of the consultations with stakeholders and others was to address key issues, and you've identified three of them. See that? Audit and compliance, safety requirements and training requirements. Did those remain key issues throughout a period up to 1 July 2009?
In as much as they were identified at that point in time and the department had put in place a series of processes to address them.
But up to, I'm going to deal with this in periods of time, up to the 1st of July 2009, did you regard a key issue of the HIP to be addressing issues of safety?
Not in the sense of safety being brought to me as an issue for consideration. Clearly, as an overall issue, it's important from day one, it ought to be, and all the way through. But my recollection of this period is that it was more, the deliberations were more around the question of, the discussions were more around the question of meeting supply and how the industry was going to manage over time. That was one of the things that was discussed. Compliance frameworks obviously were in place and being discussed at all.
What about training requirements? Because training requirements and safety have a certain symbiotic relationship.
Yes, they do.
Was that also a key issue?
Well, the training's identified in the briefs that come through to me. The department's proposing by way of establishing the training materials and working with the Skills Council starts to emerge from that point.
Because we've seen some correspondence that you've written to people saying safety was a paramount consideration. I'm just trying to explore, when the department puts up something to you, take for example the installer competencies, do you then go through the process of thinking to yourself, how does this address safety, training, compliance and audit? And what questions do you ask the department to satisfy yourself that those matters are being adequately addressed?
Well, I think you'll find that, at least in most cases, there's much more material around now than I've seen, but I think you'll find that most, if not all cases, when I've said that, it's been in the context of putting a view about the program as a whole, or alternatively, at a later date, when Matthew Fuller's, following Matthew Fuller's death. So to that extent, my expectation in terms of what the department was doing and had underway the consultations and roundtables, considerations of risk assessment, and I know there'll be additional questions about that, the feedback from the industry, beginning to establish the memorandums of understandings with fair trade and the like, are all contributors to the delivery of policy where that matter's taken into account. But I think that it's not up until really a period of time preceding Matthew Fuller's death that we're seeing the issues of safety arise as a consequence and coming to me for greater consideration, either obviously the discussion that was going on, the media that was happening at the time, the queries that emerged as a consequence of that, and the briefs that came through to us as we tried to address it.
We've seen, and you will have read recently, a number of briefs after the first fatality where you've actually not approved something the department said, or you've asked a question, sent it back for reconsideration. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see that ever having happened. I'm looking now at the period up to 1 July, and then I'm going to ask 1 July to 14 October.
Well, I think I can't remember whether we dealt with this matter, Council, when I did my voluntary interview, but the process for the delivery of briefs is that an advisor, the briefs come into my tray, they're numbered and dated at all, and for briefs that require consideration of matters that the advisor wants to draw to my attention, they'll do a green, and that green sits on.
Explain that.
So it's a green piece of paper that sits on the top of the brief. I think most ministers' offices work something like this, and probably still in practice. That green essentially are handwritten notes to alerting you to certain issues, whatever they might be, and in some cases proposing that either you amend the brief or have a further discussion or consider matters in relation to the brief, which you then respond to. You may respond to it by way of providing comment on the brief. You may send the brief back, or you may just make a note of it and agree that you'll raise it at some point. Say to yourself, you'll raise it at some point.
Is that green piece of paper something that's generated by the department or by one of your advisors?
No, it's generated by the advisor, and it's expressly there to provide the opportunity for the advisor to provide you with advice without fear or favour, which subsequently isn't cited by any other party.
What happens to the people? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go on.
No, and then those greens are subsequently destroyed after a certain period of time. There's different practices in different offices as to what happens to them.
Mr. Garrett, can I just clarify that? So there's a brief comes from the department, the professional public servants, and then the green page goes on the front. That's handwritten, and that's when the policy advisor, who is outside the normal public service, wants to draw your attention to something and make some suggestions.
That's correct.
And I see, and so those green pages are destroyed.
Yes, that's right. Usually,
I don't think we've seen it.
No, you wouldn't have. I'm not sure what the practice is. I think in our first office you'd keep them for a year in case an issue arose or whatever. But they're not intended. They're intended to be a private communication from the advisor to you. Quite often you don't have the time to meet with the advisor. If you're in the Parliament, the House is sitting at all, so it comes up as a green, and you read that green, and then you respond to it one way or the other.
Might be a breach of the Archives Act, right?
I beg your pardon?
It might be a breach of the Archives Act.
Well, it's an interesting legal question.
I don't know.
I'm not going to test your memory by asking about specific briefs, but do you recall getting green sheets of paper on briefs to do with the HIP?
My recollection is that I didn't receive a great number of greens in relation to the HIP in its early stage, and that as we saw, particularly from the first fatality, issues of safety arise, I sought more information directly back to the department, irrespective of what I was getting by way of a green or not.
Is this a fair summary that up until the first fatality you placed a good deal of trust in the advice you were getting from the department, but that trust diminished after the first fatality?
Well, it's a semi-hypothetical, and I think I want to rephrase it by saying to you that I always took the advice that was given to me seriously. I knew that a lot of work had gone into it. In respect of this program, particularly over time, I interrogated the advice more thoroughly, and I did reach a point where I wasn't trustful of all of the advice that I received, and this came about effectively around the time, and certainly as a consequence, of Matthew Fuller's death.
At around about the time of those meetings on the 27th, 28th of October, where you were getting advice from the department not to ban foil, and you were circling don't approve. And
that's correct. There's
at that time?
well, I would say before then,
right.
But I think it's made clear at that point in time. And I write a letter to the secretary on or around the date of Matthew Fuller's death, which is a summation of my views about where we had reached at this point in time.
Can I just take you then back to the brief that you got about the installer competencies?
Yes.
We can go to the specific document, but I'm going to ask you some general questions about it. Do you recall when that brief came in, first turning your mind to issues of safety?
If I provide you with an answer that says no, then I know that will be interpreted in a certain way, but I'm answering this truthfully. It was always, I think any minister would look at any brief and have in their mind questions of consequence of signing the brief, one way or the other. This was a brief which was asking me to approve guidelines in respect of training competencies. In my mind, that is something which is positive for safety. Now, I'm not saying that was the process that exactly went through my mind at the time. It's many years ago and I can't recall it precisely. But I'm responding to your question in the way that you've constructed it.
Do you recall having any discussions? You've approved that one and you haven't asked any questions in the formal document. But do you recall having any discussions with the department about whether or not this change to the installer competencies is going to impact on safety in any way?
No, I didn't. I think my assumption would have been that it would have improved the issue of safety generally. But as you and I both know, in actual fact, the attachments didn't include the sufficient level of detail that would identify for me what in actual fact was being proposed in that brief.
You had a belief in what supervision meant.
Yes, I did.
And subsequently you learnt that people behaved in a way that was inconsistent with your belief.
That's correct.
I was really focusing on that at the time you made the decision, whether you actually thought about these issues. That is, do we need to specify what supervision means? Is removing the requirement for mandatory training something we should really be doing?
Well, that wasn't provided to me by way of advice in the brief.
I'm asking about your thought processes.
Well, my thought processes are to read the brief and read it carefully, to consider whether there's any advice that's come to me from my advisors about any other technical issues or issues concerned with the attachment or particular policy issues that have arisen as a consequence and the implication of signing the brief or otherwise.
Mr. Garrett, it might be useful for the Commissioner. I've seen the numbers on the briefs. Presumably they're consecutive numbers. You were getting an enormous number of briefs from your department.
I was, that's true. I don't think they're entirely consecutive numbers though, Council Assisting, because I think there are other briefs detailing other issues that come through as well.
In other projects?
Correct.
Yes. I'm just wanting you to give a sense of your workload at the time. Like, I'm asking you questions as if you're sitting quietly in your office with hours to spare thinking about these matters. But what's the reality?
Well, any job that requires you to consider briefs that come to you has time demands on it, and the more briefs you have in front of you, the more time it's going to take. If the Parliament's sitting, you've obviously got to allocate sufficient amount of time to read those briefs when you can. And you've got other responsibility, a number of other policy areas at the time, as you know, and as well there's the general business that's going on in the Parliament, cabinet meetings and the like. So I think we do have a large number of briefs that come through, perhaps comparatively to my subsequent portfolio. Briefs that I would expect to be generated, though, in a program of this kind, even though in relation to the specific brief that we're talking about now, sufficient detail wasn't provided to me to enable me to determine, without spending even more time chasing through what those guidelines may or may not ultimately have meant.
Could I take you to an extra PG9 to your statement, which for the record is AGS 002-013-0362. While it's coming up, Mr. Garrett, I'm going to ask you some questions about the third paragraph. It's on the screen now if it's easier.
Yeah.
Now, as I understand the process, Mr. Tinsley wrote a letter to you, addressed to you, and that was then passed down to the department for reply. We have Mr. Keefe's reply. Does a copy of this then get sent back to you?
Not to me specifically, no.
You may then not be able to answer these questions, but I wanted to ask you about paragraph 3 and whether as at mid-April, you'll see the letter's dated the 16th of April, whether or not it was your understanding, as at that time, I'm sorry, I'll ask it this way. Read the third paragraph to yourself and tell me whether that was your understanding as to the intention regarding training as at mid-April 2009.
I can't answer you that question as I didn't cite this letter at this time.
But apart from this letter, was it your understanding that as at mid-April, the intention was that everyone would get insulation-specific training?
That certainly was my understanding of what we were proposing and would need it to be done over time.
And do you know why that changed?
Well, I have an idea, certainly, that it changed in part because of the demands of the program administration and delivery itself, and various time lags that took place with respect to settling training materials. The advice in front of me, I think, was that the Skills Council, I'm talking about SIPSIC now, would begin work on that material. It would be required to consult with other bodies. And then there's a subsequent question about EOS, and the interactions that were taking place between them as well and the department. I wasn't aware of the detail of that other than what was included in the briefs that I received. But on reading the briefs that we have attached to my statement, you can see that it was a process that didn't go according to time.
Because of the 1st of July rollout date?
Well, I'm saying to you that I think it was a consequence of the time at which it takes for relevant authorities to determine something like a training of this kind. I mean, it is the case that it hadn't been done and considered nationally in this way before, and it was obviously something that would take some time to happen.
Did you consider, and this is coming back full circle to some questions I asked you earlier, whether that's the sort of issue which would prompt you to say, no, we should have mandatory training for all installers. That's going to have the consequence that we can't start phase 2 on the 1st of July. I'm going to ask to push that date back to the 1st of August or the 1st of September.
Well, I would refer to advices that I received in respect of those matters, and if I'd received advice that said to the effect of the proposition that you're putting to me, a hypothetical proposition.
Is that the sort of matter that is important enough that you'd then go back and seek to push out the time?
Well, again, it would depend when the advice was given to me. It would depend on the content of the advice, whether other materials had been specifically brought to my attention, whether someone sought a meeting with me in relation to it. I mean, there's a multiplicity of issues that could come to you to determine that matter. And the briefs are essentially saying that this is our intention, this is what we want to do. They're getting me to note the work that they've done and they've undertaken. And my view would be that they would continue to do that as they've identified and outlined in the briefs.
Now, in paragraph 60 of your statement, my reading of that is this, and tell me if I misunderstand it. You had a view and continued to hold the view that there should be a requirement for 2 quotes. PCG had a contrary view, and the PCG view prevailed.
That's correct.
Do you know who in the PCG was advancing the argument that the requirement for 2 quotes should be removed?
Well, I now know, as a consequence of some material that's come into the public domain or has come into the Commission, but at the time I did not know.
Just trying to understand the thought process there. You have a view. Why do you then give in is probably not the right word. Why do you go with the PCG view as saying, no, my view is we should keep it?
No, Councillor, I don't give in, you're right. But it is certainly the case that if government comes to a view about a matter, including a policy matter within the remit of a minister's determination, and that is the view of government, and at this point in time, from my perspective and from my vantage point, if you like, this was the view of government.
But are you talking about government there in the sense of the executive government or government in terms of the public service?
I'm talking about executive government.
But this is a decision of the PCG, which is a group of public servants and consultants.
Yes, but this is a matter that was also subject to discussion, if you like, at the executive level of government as well, and that's also referred to in my statement.
Right. And hence you yielded to the PCG view?
Well, at that particular time.
Was there ever an occasion that you can recall where a view endorsed by the PCG and put to you for approval was rejected by you?
By the PCG, not off the top of my head, although I'd have to go back and look at it. But PCG views on matters that were policy matters ought to be reflected in briefs that come to me for consideration. And so I think we have a number of those briefs towards the back end of this statement that illustrates that I don't accept when I didn't accept it and sent it back.
Was that PCG recommendations or more advice from the Department of Environment?
Yeah, look, it's a fair question. It's a group that's established. I don't know that they've got the status of formal recommendations. It's more to the extent of advice, and it's also advice about a position that was considered the position at that particular point in time, and that in itself would be subject to additional discussion, perhaps with the executive or otherwise.
Did you receive copies of the PCG minutes?
Not that I can recall.
To your knowledge, did your office receive copies of the PCG minutes?
Look, it's my expectation that they would, and I can't recall. I didn't
So
go.
that they would or wouldn't?
Would.
Would, yes.
Yeah, but not necessarily. I mean, there are a range of committees that departments establish to look at a range of things which create minutes, and I think at the end of the day, frankly, there has to be a bit of an assessment about whether or not even advisors and others can manage the paper flow that's coming through any office, including looking at the minutes of a committee meeting made up of departmental officials.
At each...
Just interrupt my learned friend before he departs from this paragraph. The reference to paragraph 159 at the end of paragraph 60 should plainly be to paragraph 158. That should have something I should
Thanks,
have
Mr.
We're aware as a matter of fact that risk registers were considered at each PCG meeting. Do you know whether copies of the risk registers were sent to your office?
Only in as much as at a much later date, when this became a live issue, both in the Parliament and abroad, that a copy of the risk register was identified.
In your office?
Correct.
But you have, do I understand correctly, you have no memory of it coming to your attention?
No, I have no memory of it coming to my attention. It wasn't attached to any briefings that came to me, and I didn't cite it.
Now, in paragraph 61 of your statement, you say that you also received... sorry, I'm just trying to pick up the passage I'm looking for. Yes. You see there that you received briefs about progress of the HIP or particular aspects of it, such as fraud and compliance, which was a key risk, and asked to be updated on. Did you also seek to be updated on matters of safety, including training? I look at those as complementary.
Well, in relation to incidences or matters that related specifically to safety, I would expect to be updated in relation to those, and I think subsequent or through this period, for example, the incidences of fires were noted in some briefs that came to me.
What I was really asking about is you make a point in paragraph 61 of saying that you saw fraud and compliance as a key risk and requested to be updated on progress in this area, whether you did the same thing in relation to safety and training.
At the point in time when safety emerged as an issue that required greater consideration, then of course I had discussions and sought to make sure that what we were doing was going to lead to there being increased safety, and made a set of decisions further down the track. At this point in time, or at least perhaps earlier than this, in terms of along the timeline, fraud and compliance issues were the ones that were being reported to me, and I could see, as it were, that it was an issue that required us to have our eye on it.
You certainly sought updates when issues occurred or events occurred which showed that there were safety concerns, such as fires or injuries. But I'm wondering whether you sought updates in relation to more of a preventative role of the program, in the sense that part of the function was to prevent people being killed or injured, as opposed to reacting when those events occurred.
Well, this is a program that was being rolled out quickly in response to the global financial crisis, as we know, and I think that in part determined the timing issues that you've been referring to in your earlier questions. And there's a great body of material already that we're looking at that's coming through the Office for consideration, and to the extent that in my early answer I addressed that question around overall risk frameworks, consultation with industry, developing a training program and the like, certainly that gave rise to a view from my perspective that these issues were in play, but the rollout was happening very quickly, and we're talking about a period, I think, of some months here, even less between sort of one set of issues and another arising.
Was the view ever expressed to you, and if it was, I'm going to ask you by whom, that the responsibility for the safety of workers was one that lay primarily with the employer, their duty of care to their employees, and with the states, because they had the occupational health and safety regulatory regime?
Well, as you know, the briefs do contain sentences or statements or briefing advices broadly consistent with the wording that you've used there.
Did you agree with that?
Well, my view about responsibility is that we share responsibilities in the delivery of government programs. We share a responsibility with those other institutions that equally have them, such as state regulatory bodies, employers, ultimately employees as well. People have a duty of care responsibility and the like. So I'm certainly mindful of the fact that as a government minister delivering a program, there's a responsibility to the best of your capacity to ensure that it's delivered in a way which minimises risk. You're never going to get rid of risk altogether in any course of life.
And how did the HIP do that from the Commonwealth's perspective?
Reduction of risk?
Or minimisation of risk?
Well, in relation to the measures that were put in place over time in terms of the program delivery, provided another level, if you like, of regulation where hitherto one didn't exist. And as well as that, the additional audit and compliance practices that were put into place and over time, to some extent at least, accelerated.
Can I take you then to paragraph 63 of your statement to ask you a few questions about that? Did you become aware that the Office of the Coordinator General had performed its own work in developing a delivery model for the program?
At some point, I know that came up and was provided to me as information.
Reading 63 and 64 together, was that a matter discussed between yourself and Senator Arbib on the 2nd of April?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was the second or third.
And was it explained to you either by Senator Arbib or by any officer of the department that the reason why the Office of Coordinator General performed that work was because of a concern that the model being worked on by the department wouldn't be ready by the 1st of July?
Not in those terms. I don't recall it being put to me in those terms, although obviously I was in the broad aware of issues around the development of the model.
Were you aware that before the 31st of March the department was working on what's been described as a regional brokerage model?
Yes, I was in general terms.
And that the model worked on by the Office of Coordinator General and which was subsequently adopted was direct payments to installers through what ultimately was used as Medicare. Did anyone from the department advise you, I can't see it in the briefs, but it might have been outside of that process, that they didn't agree with that?
Not to my recollection, in formal terms, no.
In informal terms?
Not that I can recall.
Or that they had concerns about the direct payment method?
No, I can't actually recall anyone raising concerns about the direct payment method. I think if there were any discussion, it would have likely been around the question of, effectively, we had two models that were for consideration for government. They'd worked on a model and another model had emerged. I know this is quite a strong focus of some of the questions and the like. I don't consider it to be such an exceptional issue, Council, I have to say to you. I think if the workings of government, it's quite common for there to be different models that are emerging for consideration. Ultimately, you want to choose the model that best suits the public policy purpose. But there's lots of information going back and forward from officials about that.
I suspect the concern may more be, Mr. Garrett, that work was done on the earlier model in terms of risk assessment. When the model changed, that work might not have been performed on the new model.
Well, I think there's always the opportunity to look back onto that action from this particular perspective. I'm not dissenting from your observation. Although I would say that the advice that I received is advice to the extent that this is what has been proposed this is how we propose to deliver it. These are the elements of the delivery, and are you agreeable as a minister to do that? And then away you go.
I simply have two questions for you. Do I understand you correctly that when the model was put up in the briefings to you, no one from the department expressed concern or reservations to you which would have led you to make further inquiries to the appropriateness of the direct payment model?
No, not as I recall.
And then in terms of the issue that we've been talking about of safety and training, when the model is being put up to you, do you then go through that process of saying, okay, how does this change impact on safety and training?
Well, my understanding was that the original commitments that have been made in policy terms to deliver a training module would continue.
Again, this might be a matter of language. In paragraph 64, when you talk about the discussion with Senator Arbib, you use the phrase, we were broadly in agreement with the proposed approach. That suggests to me that you may not have been in total agreement.
Well, I can't recall the exact substance of that conversation.
Were there matters that you recall that you were not in agreement about?
To the extent that the work had already been undertaken by the department and it was a model that had been essentially put forward under my aegis, I obviously wanted to discuss to some extent, well, here's the model and now we have another one that's proposed. But that we resolved that discussion to my recollection, and having resolved it, we moved on.
Can I take you then to PG 13, which for the record is AGS 002-008-3542. Do you recall a meeting taking place at your office in Sydney with Ms Cruck, Senator Arbib and Mr Hoffman?
I do.
And does that annexure accurately encapsulate the discussion?
No, not entirely.
Which parts do you say don't accurately encapsulate the discussion?
Well, certainly in parenthesis,
Yes.
which is not an advice or a comment that deserves any other response from me. Obviously, I'll answer a question if you ask it. I don't recall each detail of each sentence there, but certainly that would be, that's a record of the meeting and an email to somebody about it.
I was just giving you that opportunity because really the only paragraph that I wanted to ask you about is the one following that one that contains the parentheses, also strong agreement. See that? Strong agreement on the need for project management.
Yes, I can see it.
Yes. Do you recall matters being said at that meeting which raised doubts as to the capacity of the Department of Environment to actually bring this project to readiness for rollout on the 1st of July?
I don't recall that being put to me at this meeting, no.
Do you recall there being a discussion on the need for project management expertise ASAP?
Again, I don't recall it at this particular meeting, no.
Do you recall there being discussion at that meeting about the need for a project control group?
Not specifically.
Do you have any present recollection as you sit there as to that meeting?
No, not really. I know that it took place and that these matters were discussed in the general but as for the specifics, no, I don't have a recollection.
Now, were you aware that on the same day as that meeting, there was a meeting of the technical advisory group of to the department? Can I bring up AGS 00201414332, please? While it's being brought up, do you recall being told that the department was taking advice from industry experts?
I think one of the early briefs talks about broad consultation with stakeholders, and whether it refers specifically to industry experts, Council, I can't say. But in relation to the question that you've just put to me, no.
Can I just ask you, have you, for the purpose of giving evidence today, seen this document recently?
I'm not sure.
I'll give you the opportunity to skim read it if you haven't, but if you have, please tell me.
The one that's in front of us now?
Yes.
And you asking me if I'm aware of this or not?
I'm asking you whether you've read it recently. Otherwise, I was going to give you the opportunity to at least skim read it.
No, I haven't.
Okay. Well, can I ask you, take note of the fact that this is on the same day as you're meeting with people from the department and Senator Arbib. If we go to the end, we'll see Annexure B who the attendees are. You'll see that there are, working from the bottom up, a number of people from the department, and then there is somebody from South Australia, and then above that we have Dr Fricker, Mr Marker, Mr Cox, Mr Jones from various organisations which have particular expertise, and Mr Ash from the Building Codes Board. Do you see that? So
Yes.
they're the people that were at the meeting.
Yep.
If we go back to the first page, I particularly wanted to draw your attention to, if we can scroll up a bit, the section headed Safety. And if you want to read more, by all means do so, but I wanted to draw your attention particularly to the first two dot points.
Okay.
Were you aware of that information?
No.
Do you think you should have been made aware of that information?
Yes.
The last sentence in the first dot point is pretty serious stuff, isn't it?
Worded in that way, yes.
Is it your evidence that that advice was never communicated to you, that the technical group had met and reached and concluded in those terms?
Certainly nothing that I can recall informally, and formally in terms of my advice is no.
Could I take you then? Did you want to read any? They're the 2 points I wanted to ask you about.
I've had a little bit more of a read. Thank you, Council.
Yes. Could I take you then to PG 14 to your statement? AGS 002012124. Now, this is one of the briefs that's sent through to you in April, 9th of April. Just in terms of context, the 9th of April, we know as a matter of fact, is the date that the risk register is presented to the department. It's not referred to in this document on my reading of it. But I wanted to ask you, under the heading of issues and sensitivities, the fourth dot point, can you reread that to yourself?
We can't cite it.
Can we go up a bit? There we go. Development and selection.
Yep. I'm familiar with this dot point.
Did you ask to see a copy of the comprehensive risk assessment facilitated by Minter Ellison Consulting?
No, I didn't.
Why not?
In the ordinary course of my role as a minister, I wouldn't seek to cite something of that sort. I'm advised about it. I can read that it's been undertaken, and I'd be comforted by the fact that it was, but I wouldn't, of normal practice or necessity, ask to see it itself.
Then a little further on, after the semicolon, however, residual risk around, and you'll see those matters there, including installer and household safety, will remain. Did you seek to clarify what was meant about that?
No, I didn't. To the extent that an advisor would provide me with additional advice on a brief of this sort, if there were matters that they believed I needed to either inquire to the department about or otherwise, I may have, but on the face of it and reading it on the face of it now, the answer is no.
Do you agree that it draws to your attention the fact that first a risk assessment's been done, and secondly, it's telling you that there will be residual risk around, inter alia, installer and household safety?
That's what it states, and that would be my understanding.
Didn't you think you should find out what the residual risk was and how high it was?
No, I didn't, because there's a sentence that follows that, which refers to what was being proposed to particularly manage those risks.
Mm. But in order to make sure that what's said in that sentence came to pass, didn't you need to know what the residual risks were?
Well, that would be a matter for my department and advisors to highlight for me if they determined it to be necessary. It would also be a matter for me to inquire for if I determined it to be necessary. But on the basis of this brief and the way in which this brief was expressed, no.
There don't seem to be any negatives in this brief.
No.
And I take it that I'll ask it in an open way. Were you told at any time that it was the view of Minter Ellison Consulting, and in particular the person from that organisation who was facilitating the risk assessment, that it was only risks to the Commonwealth that needed to be managed?
Was I specifically told that?
Yes.
No.
Did you become aware of that at any time subsequently?
Not until you've begun your inquiry, and then it's been drawn to my attention.
So I take you then to paragraph 72 of your statement. And simply ask you, wouldn't you have... I would have expected you to ask for a copy of the risk management plan and the risk register straight after Mr Fuller's death. I'm just wondering why you didn't see it until the 11th of February 2010.
My inquiries subsequent to Mr Fuller's death were to the extent of understanding what we additionally needed to do and what matters we ought to address in the future. And that wasn't a matter that specifically came up for discussion at that point in time.
Have you subsequently looked at the risk register?
I have.
Is it the one as at 9 April, which is, I think, attached as part of your statement?
I looked at it at the point of time when it became an issue in the Parliament.
Yes. Were you aware that there were a series of risk registers? That is, it was a document that was updated from time to time?
I was aware to the extent that continuous improvement was built into the policy development and model delivery. but not until such time as I looked at a subsequent version at that later time.
In the document that you've attached, and we have a larger copy if you need to see it, as at 9 April, the risk of injury to installers wasn't included as a specific risk in the register. Did you notice that?
When I subsequently came to look at it, I did.
Did that surprise you?
Yes.
Did you look at subsequent registers to see if it was ever put in?
I didn't go through subsequent registers. This happened subsequent to the issue being raised as to whether or not I'd cited the risk register at the time when it was first being developed by Minter Ellison.
Did you ever seek to find out why it wasn't included in at least the version of the risk register that you saw?
No.
Paragraph 75 of the statement. Could I bring up AGS 002-032-0580, please?
Council, can I qualify my answer to you that I've just given?
Yes.
I think it's probably the case that discussion around the risk register did emerge in the course of considering the latter stages of briefs and safety issues. I can't say whether or not there was a specific inquiry as to what had happened to each risk register and why it was that, for example, the safety of installers was neither that present in an earlier one or the role that it placed at a latter one. But I do know that there was a discussion about risk registers generally and the process that had been entered into.
That's what I was asking. That was after the first fatality?
This is when the issue of the risk register was brought to my attention.
That's a little later than that.
That's correct.
Yes. In paragraph 75, I was looking at, you were informed by your department that there'd been a meeting on the 29th of April. Do you see that?
Yep.
I'm just showing you, if we can go back to that other document, the minutes of that meeting. And again, if you want to read more of it than I show you, please tell me. But this is with people from the various states and territories and officers of the department. And what I particularly wanted to refer you to, if we can scroll up a little, is agenda item 2. If you just read that to yourself. Excuse me for a minute.
That's right.
Yes, my learned friend draws to my attention. I'll come back to that. Just on this question though, was that information brought to your attention?
No.
In your view, should it have been?
Well, to the extent that there was a more definitive decision arrived at from this committee meeting, then that may have been the case or not. Given that this was a meeting that was conducted at a departmental level where I wouldn't expect to see any of the information referred to, it wouldn't come through to a minister. But I can see what it says, so there's no reason why I wouldn't think that it shouldn't at some point be drawn to my attention.
I suppose it raises this question. Did you have any concerns before the 1st of July that the size of the HIP was such that the states and territories would have difficulty coping with the OH&S regulatory regime that they administered?
No, I didn't.
Did you make any inquiries yourself of your state and territory counterparts to find out if that should be a concern?
As you know, I spoke to my state and territory counterparts, or we had communications at a subsequent date. My response to this, as you're putting it to me now, is that in the ordinary course of policy development, there will be a number of risks that are identified, including in a program of this kind. And it's the requirement of those to whom the risks are communicated to address them or to respond. And if it requires modifications or changes to a proposed policy or the way in which a policy is being delivered, and policy authority to do that, then that needs to be referred to the more senior officials for consideration, and then ultimately it comes through to the Minister's office for a brief itself.
Did you ever give any consideration to recommending to those who made the decisions that this was a program that would be better dealt with by the states because they had the OH&S regulatory regimes?
This was a fiscal stimulus program, Council, and as you may be aware, and as some others may be aware, the question of the level of occupational health and safety and the application of those laws was something which had not been addressed with any degree of seriousness by our predecessors as government. I was aware of that. That being the case, and it is always the case in the regulatory frame where you're trying to determine a national delivery of a national policy, where you get a variety of different state regulations or guidelines, or perhaps no regulation at all, that's very inefficient in terms of delivering public policy.
But here, as I understand it, under the Nation Building and Jobs Plan, a number of projects were funded by the Commonwealth but in fact carried out by the states. Whether any thought was given to doing the same thing with the HIP?
There wasn't a proposition that was ever put to me or discussed in my office.
My question is, did you ever consider that?
No, I didn't.
Now, the matter that was brought to my attention, if I can take you back to your statement and to paragraph 72. You see there, you say in the third line, neither I nor my staff saw the risk register. How do you come to the view that your staff did not see the risk register until 22 February 2010?
When the existence of the risk register was first brought to our notice and to my notice, I asked my staff whether anyone had seen it, and the reply was negative.
Have you subsequently learnt that the risk register was sent through to Mr Levy?
I understand that at some point it had come through to Mr Levy, but I'm still not certain whether Mr Levy saw it or not at that time.
I see. Okay. Could I take you then to paragraph 76 of your statement? I just wanted to get you to expand on the first sentence. As more information came to my attention concerning potential gaps or risks, I sought to immediately address them. From 1 July to 14 October, did any occasion arise for you to act as you've said there?
Other than what's noted in the briefs specifically?
There doesn't seem to be anything other than seeking an update on audit and compliance activity.
Right. No.
And we can see what happened after the 14th of October. When you, I think you've made this point in your statement, that there might not have been an attachment to a brief in the data room. Can I bring up AGS 002 012 1230? AGS 002 012 1230. Now, you've referred to this in your statement. This is the brief where you're asked to approve those three items referred to under purpose. When you received this document, I take it you read it?
Yes.
And you would have read under the heading Issues Can we go down, please? The second dot point, in particular paragraph number 2.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to be explained in here why the removal of mandatory training for all installers is being done.
That's correct.
Did you ask?
Can I go to this brief in my...
Yes, sure.
What number is it?
18.
18, thank you.
Sorry. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Well, the brief contains the information by way of advice to me. I think some of this information's already in a previous brief.
Yes.
So it's already come through for my citing. And the brief also refers to the consultations that the department's undertaken. So on that basis, I've signed the brief.
Now, if we just then go to AGS 002 0121232, please. Mr. Garrett, this is attachment A to that brief, and I think you said you hadn't had the opportunity of seeing the attachments to it. This is the document which sets out the terms and conditions for being included in the installer register, and as you point out in subparagraph A, there's reference to a web link,
Yes.
if you like. But otherwise, that document simply sets out the various rules and regulations for getting onto the installer register. So I'll take you then to AGS 002 0121235, please. This is attachment B to the brief, which is the competency requirements. Do you recall seeing a document like this at the time the brief was sent to you?
No.
Do you recall reading the competency requirements that were attached to the brief?
No.
You don't?
No.
Sorry, I just want to understand that. Do you say that the competency requirements were or were not attached to the brief?
No, they were attached to the brief. Well, the brief says that they were attached to them.
But you didn't read them?
Well, it may be that... Well, I have no recollection of reading them. So
Surely you must have.
Well, Council, I might just provide the answer. It may be that the attachments themselves were no longer a part of the brief as it came to me. In other words, if there were a great number of briefs in my in-tray, and quite often my in-tray did have a great number of briefs in it, and there were bulky attachments that were along with that brief, they may have been taken out by an advisor. Briefs were sometimes prioritised for me to consider, which weren't briefs in the in-tray itself, but were briefs in sort of more like a red in-tray, which may or may not include the attachments. I wouldn't always read the attachments of briefs unless I felt that there was a important reason to do so, and in most cases I wouldn't, because my expectation would be that the attachments are the things that advisors are there to read for, because if I tried to read every attachment to every brief that came to me, there just wouldn't be the opportunity to continue to do your work as a minister to do that.
You accept that this is a very important document that you're approving?
Well, recall that I've already had a brief that refers to these competency requirements as well, and I've already signed off on those competency requirements in effect in a prior brief as well. So I understand what the brief is saying.
But you don't recall reading what 1 1/3 A4 sheets to make sure that it was in accordance with your understanding?
Well, I'm not willing to say that those sheets were in front of me for consideration. The brief was, but I didn't cite this particular piece of paper.
Well, looking at it now, and I presume you've looked at it relatively recently as well.
Well, I'm looking at it now.
Yeah. Do you see paragraphs numbered 1 and 2?
Yes.
And the particular part that we've had some interest in is paragraph 2B. Does that accurately reflect your understanding of the competency requirement change that was made as a result of this brief dated the 28th of May 2009?
No, as I state in my statement, no.
In what respect doesn't it adequately reflect your understanding?
Well, no advice came to me that, in effect, supervision, that the requirements could be applied to someone who is merely supervising the roles that were identified themselves.
We might be at slightly cross purposes. You certainly had an understanding as to what supervised meant.
Yes,
You subsequently found out that other people didn't share that understanding.
that's right.
But at the time you approved this change with that understanding in your mind, did that accurately reflect the change to the competency that you intended to make?
Well, I signed off on the brief that was in front of me on the basis of the advice that was in the brief. I didn't interrogate the attachment. Whether the attachment was actually physically attached to the brief or not, I can't say. And it was on the basis of the brief and the previous brief that I signed this brief.
Did you realise at the time that the need for training of novices was being deleted?
I beg your pardon, Commissioner?
Did you realise at the time that the need for training of novices was actually being deleted?
No.
Could I take you then to paragraph 81 of your statement? And this refers to a brief that you actioned on the 6th of June. I wanted to look at the passage that you've extracted and ask why you've emphasised paragraph numbered 2.
That's been extracted, Council, to essentially reinforce what I said in answer to an earlier question, that this advice contained in briefs, or alternatively, these propositions contained in briefs, were made clear to me, and it's an indication that these matters were under consideration.
But you understood that industry expressed the view in paragraph 1 subject to what was in paragraph 2.
Yes.
But as we've just seen some weeks earlier, the requirement for mandatory training had been removed.
Yes.
I'm just trying to reconcile why you place emphasis on paragraph 2 when the industry is saying we want development of training packages for national rollout with a program that's not mandating training.
Well, as we've just been through in answer to the previous question, that specific aspect wasn't something which was made clear to me in the signing of those earlier briefs.
Do you think it should have been made explicit?
I think I've already answered that question, so yes, but this is a reflection of the advice that was contained in a subsequent brief to me.
Now, can we go then to paragraph 86? And this talks about what in shorthand we call the pocketbook. Did you read the draft of the pocketbook Sorry, I'll ask a preliminary question. Were you provided with a copy of the draft of the pocketbook?
Not that I recall.
So this is information which you've put in as a result of reading it relatively recently?
Correct.
Yep. I show you CPS 002-001-1433. And just to give you some context, Mr. Garrett, the draft of the pocketbook was circulated to various industry representatives for their comments. And then some of those were incorporated into the finalised version of the pocketbook. And we know from evidence given to the Commission that the second email on the page found its way to the Department of Environment. But it started as a statement by a representative of Fletcher Insulation, that's FI, an internal document, then it was provided to SIPSIC and then to the Department. You'll read the first, or read the whole of the email, it's only three.
I've read it.
Was that information provided to you?
No.
Was that the sort of information that you think should have been provided to you?
Well, you're putting a series of propositions or hypotheticals to me, Council, and I think that in order to answer a body of them, I'd answer it this way. If there was sufficient information coming through to the department to give rise to an apprehension that in actual fact there was a greater risk than was currently being contemplated and managed, then the department ought to have given consideration to that and proposed to me or notified me that they thought there should be changes to the program or otherwise. Now, there may be other things. I don't know whether it was one email or two. You've shown me one email. I don't know how many emails there were. I don't know what the response, if there was one, to this email was. But on the face of it, in terms of what you're putting to me, the answer is yes.
Well, on the face of it, and also combined with the fact that on the 18th of February, Mr. Roos had told a meeting that there had been the situation in New Zealand where 3 people had electrocuted themselves. I can tell you as a matter of fact, on the following day, Mr. Roos sent an email to Ms. Riordan in the department expanding on that. On the 3rd of April, the technical advisory group advised, as we saw, that there was a high risk of death or catastrophic injury. And now this. Surely you must agree that these are matters that should have been brought to your attention.
Yes, I do. And I think it's indicative of the fact that the briefs that came to me did not necessarily contain either advices or information, or even reports, if you like, of this kind, sufficient to make me believe that we needed to address issues around program design or program delivery. And I'm in agreement with you.
And I suspect the question hardly needs to be asked. The answer is obvious. Had you been aware of each of those pieces of information I've just outlined to you, you would have taken action on them.
Yes, I would have.
I take you to paragraph 110 of your statement.
I'm sorry, which number?
110. And again, I suspect I know the answer to this. Were you provided with the pocketbook as finalised, contemporaneously with its completion? Or is that something you've read recently?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Were you provided with the finalised, or what you call the updated pocketbook, contemporaneously with its preparation, or is this something you've read recently?
No, that's right. That's something which I've subsequently become aware of. I think a version of the pocketbook was included in a brief at a point in time, but I think it's subsequent to this from memory.
In November?
That's correct.
And it was revised again?
Correct.
Were you, or to your knowledge, was your office sent copies of the installer advices that you refer to in your statement?
To my knowledge, some installer advices, including installer advices at a latter stage, came to the office for consideration, and sometimes for consideration by Mr. Levy and potential redrafts.
Did you
when and where that happened, how early that happened, I don't have that information.
Did your office ever suggest that an installer advice be sent out on a particular topic?
I think towards the end of the program, we certainly were conscious of the fact that communications were absolutely critical with installers, and whether we specifically requested an installer advice or not, I can't recall, but I suspect we probably did ask for them at that point.
Does that suggest that you were monitoring the installer advices because you wanted to get a particular message out?
Consistent with my other answers, I think, certainly following Matthew Fuller's death and subsequently, particularly with the program changes and the additional measures that we brought to bear, at some point I know I did have a look at a installer advice to make sure that what we said should be in it was in it.
And that was particularly after the meeting you had with Mr Richards from the Master Electricians
That's correct.
Association. To your knowledge, were you aware that as at the 1st of July, the audit and compliance function of the program was not completed?
No, I wasn't.
You weren't advised of that fact?
I don't believe it's contained in the briefs that we have here, and that being the case, I know that I subsequently asked at a much later date for either a review.
In August there was a brief where you'd asked for an update.
That's right, when I asked the update.
Paragraph 97 of your statement, you refer to the fact that the government's starting position was that the industry already had a regulatory framework. Do I take it from the balance of that paragraph that what you mean there is simply the OH&S regulation in each state and territory from South Australia?
And South Australia's licensing and any other matters that may pertain to the installation of insulation.
Were you aware of any other than the basic OH&S regulation?
No.
In paragraph 98, you say that you knew that there was not going to be any mandatory training. In paragraph 98 you say training had been identified as something that was always going to be an element of the program. Yes?
That's right.
But you became aware, I'll ask it, did you become aware at some point that that was not the case?
This is consistent with my earlier answers, yes.
And when did you become aware of that?
It would be a good deal later than where we are now.
After
Council.
the first fatality or before that?
I can't give you a definitive answer.
You say in paragraph 102, I'm just trying to put this in terms of a date, that you sought advice on whether additional training should be put in place.
That's subsequent to, certainly to the Matthew Fuller fatality and subsequent to that.
Can I go to 137 of your statement? And to PG 50, which for the record is QIC 006 001 2916.
Mr. Wilson, at some point, I think we'll just have a 2 or 3 minute break just to stretch our legs.
Be indebted to you, Commissioner.
Whenever you like.
Perhaps if I just deal with this topic and then do that. The question I wanted to ask you was this, Mr. Garrett. If we go to the 3rd page, this is the minutes of a meeting that was held on the 12th of October. You were only there for part of the meeting. We go to the 3rd page. We'll see agenda item, Minister Garrett's session via telephone or teleconference. See that?
Yes.
And then the second last dot point. Whether you have any recollection of the discussion that took place about training in light of what's written there.
Not additional to what we're seeing here.
Do I read that correctly, that there is a discussion at that meeting on the 12th of October that there needed to be some lifting or upgrading of installer skills?
Well, you're phrasing the question. I understand why you're phrasing the question that way. It's not clear from the way in which it's put in the dot point.
I'm really asking for your...
Yes.
That prompts your recollection?
Well, I think there were a number of issues that were crucial to, or that the industry were putting up at this point in time, and in some ways what we're seeing here is almost like a priorities list of those issues, and I'm not trying to say any more than that. So I think my time with them would have been quite brief, as time that ministers have for these meetings generally is. So it obviously did come up, but I can't recall any substantive discussion or propositions that were put to me at that point in time about it. They may have been, but I can't recall them.
Is that a convenient time, Commissioner?
Adjourn for 5 minutes.
Mr Garrett, I wanted you to take you to paragraph 138 of your statement and to annexure PG 51, which for the record is QIC 006 001 2990. You're familiar with this document, I presume?
Yes, I am.
I take you down to the bottom of the document. You're aware, as at the date you sent this letter, that the circumstances in which Mr Fuller was electrocuted involved the practice of stapling foil material. See that?
That's correct.
Now, what steps did you take? And in that, I mean, what steps did you instruct others to take on your behalf to make sure that the insulation industry was informed of this practice and the dangers that it presented?
Well, I think you'll see in my statement, Council, amongst other things, that involved receiving advice or seeking advice that was received by the department as a matter of urgency concerning additional measures under the program that might increase safety. I'd be confident from my own recall that that also meant installer advices drawing attention to that matter being sent, and then convening a meeting. The subsequent meeting, I'll just refer to my statement. That takes place with the industry.
This is on the 27th of October.
That's right.
You see, really my question is this: if we go to AGS 0, this is annexure 45 to your statement, but if we go to that annexure, which is AGS 002 003 0608, and you have there a bundle of installer advices, we see that installer advice 11, which is the first one after the fatality, talks generally about safety but doesn't go, warning.
That's correct.
Can you offer any insight into, A, whether you knew the installer advice was going out in those terms, and whether you gave any direction to perhaps highlight the issue?
I can't recall whether I knew that this installer advice was going out in these terms, but I suspect that's not, given the timelines that we have. I do know that I paid attention to installer advices subsequent to Matthew Fuller's death, and installer advice 12 or 13, I can't remember off the top of my head which one it is, but I think it's in here.
It's the special edition one.
That's correct. I wanted to make sure that we were being specific about what it was we wanted to communicate to installers.
But even in installer advice 12, and if you want to look at it, by all means tell me, even it doesn't say a man has died doing this. Be careful. Still in general language.
Well, there's a fair amount of information that is contained in these advices which draws attention to people what the likely consequences of not following the advice are.
And certainly in Installer Advice 12 you extract some information from the Master Electricians Association, but perhaps nothing focuses the mind of the installer more than one of your colleagues has died doing this, so be careful.
Well, I think you're looking through the prism of what else might there have been that added to this to provide additional information. I think this is quite comprehensive. Ultimately, these questions about the kind of language that you use and the way in which you use are a matter of judgment. And for those who are specialists in communication, you normally receive some advice or draft forms of wording. In this case, my own view was that we needed to communicate very clearly to people what the risks were.
An allied question is this. You're aware, perhaps within a few days of the 14th of October, because there was still some investigation taking place, that a man had died stapling metal foil to a ceiling joist, doing work under the program. Can you explain to the Commission why you didn't take steps immediately to suspend the use of foil until it was clarified that it was safe to continue using it?
Well, I felt two things were important. I didn't know the circumstances immediately of Matthew Fuller's death, and there may have been other circumstances to be considered, and that's why I wrote to Cameron Dick encouraging him to hold a coronial inquiry, because I think only then will you get sort of investigative opportunities to understand truly what did happen. A lot of media reports around these things and around this program previously had been inaccurate. I'm not saying all the time, and I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but I'm sure there is one. But in any event, I felt that was the right course of action. And from the point of view of the department, to go and seek advice from the regulator, the Electrical Safety Office, convene a meeting with the industry. There were divergent views amongst the industry. I think obviously the Foil Association, Industry Association, were not of a mind that it produced a risk, and to seek advice from the department so I could determine whether or not that is the step that we should take. My recollection, Council, is that the advice that came back to me was that the Electrical Safety Office was not recommending at that point in time that foil be banned from the program. I didn't accept the advice of my department at that point because I didn't feel it was satisfactory, so I said let's go back again and make sure that we understand the ramifications of this decision, particularly as we've had a terrible loss of life of this young kid.
Is it overly simplistic? But really my question was this. Yes, you did all these investigations and you wrote and you asked questions, but the immediate reaction wasn't to suspend it till you made sure that it was safe to continue. It was really to allow the program to continue with people potentially doing the same thing as Matthew Fuller for a number of weeks.
Well, I felt that the responsible course of action as a minister was to urgently seek advice, to receive more information as to what actually had or had not happened and what the circumstances of that event were, and additionally to be able to consult with the industry, as we effectively had been doing for a number of months around this issue, and then on that basis to make that decision. From my perspective, that is the responsible way that a minister goes around making a decision. Now, I understand why you're putting that question to me in that way, but that would have been my thinking at the time. It's still my thinking today.
Well, you were made aware at any time around the decision that you made not to ban foil but to ban the use of metal fasteners, that there was the same risk with plastic fasteners as there was with metal fasteners. That is, plastic staple could be driven through the foil, pierce a wire, and the wire could touch the foil, which was internally conductive. Was that ever raised with you?
Well, you can see that this issue is raised in the briefs, and Malcolm Richards raises it with me when I meet with him, and I respond to what he put to me, and then I ultimately make the decision. But again, there were divergent views contained in those briefs about whether or not it actually would make a difference. And I think what was challenging, and I know this word's been used a hell of a lot here, I've tried not to use it too much, but was that where we had organisations like Master Builders or the Housing Industry Association effectively wanting to say to a minister, look, stop adding regulations, even if you think it's going to produce more safety, or this is sort of implicit in what they're putting to us, that's not necessarily something that you ought to do at this point in time, or we don't have a unanimous view on this matter. And that was the case on a couple of these things. It was reflected in the briefs, but ultimately, by this stage, I took the view that it was, this had happened, and if it was going to reduce the likelihood of it happening again, then we should do it.
Could I take you to AGS 002 023 3186? And while that's being brought up, could I take you, Mr. Garrett, to paragraph 146 of your statement and to paragraph subnumbered 3, subparagraph 3.
(146).
146.
Yes.
You see the question, what exact warnings did EEOS give? And if we can bring up that document. AGS 002 023 3186. While that's being brought up, were you aware that the views of EEOS had been sought in February 2009?
Yes, I was.
And did you see the information that EEOS provided to the department?
Not at that time, from recollection.
Do you recall when you saw that information? I'm trying to have it brought up. Here we are. We go down to Mr. Plevy's email. That's it, from EEOS. Do you see that? 27 February at 10:24.
Yes, I can.
Have you seen this document before?
No.
I'll just ask you to read the last three.
I've read them.
You've read that?
Martin and then the 3 paragraphs.
Yes. You've read that? Can we go over the page then? It's sufficient to read what's on the screen there. Were you aware that that information had been communicated by EEOS to the department in February?
Well, I was aware that there was some communication. No, not the specifics of this communication.
And do I correctly read paragraph 146 that you weren't aware of that information as at 22 October 2009? Otherwise, it would have been included in the answer to that particular question.
And that's the subject of my query.
Yes.
As you know, EEOS were involved in the process of engagement with the department in the working up of materials. That's a Skills Council process. But in terms of the communication that you've identified in that email, yes, that's correct. I hadn't cited it.
And I'll ask you the same question as I've asked of other pieces of information. Do you consider that that information was something that should have been drawn to your attention?
Yes, in the sense that it relates to specifically the risks that were later identified. Although I would add to that from the period of February to the period of September and then October, EEOS were involved in some interactions with the department, and I think also from memory with my advisors on general training matters.
Yes.
And it would have been my expectation that out of that interaction, if additional advice was needed, it would have come up for me for consideration, or additional information about risk.
Yes. Paragraph 147, and I particularly wanted to take you to PG 63, which operator is AGS 002-014-0409. Now, this is a brief that came in 21 October 2009. Seems to have been received on 23 October. Do you see that?
Yes, I can.
If we go to the bottom of that page under the heading Issues, you've looked at this document recently.
Yes.
When you made the decision ultimately not to ban the use of or suspend the use of foil per se, did you take into account the qualifier, the proviso to paragraph number 1?
I'm not sure of your question, Counsel.
That is, you're being told that the risks associated with foil are proportionately no more significant, etc.,
That's right.
providing that. You see that?
Yes.
Did you make any inquiry to determine what were the appropriate safety measures when installing aluminium foil, particularly horizontally across ceiling joists?
I didn't approve that recommendation on the basis that I wasn't satisfied.
No, but ultimately we know.
Sorry, I'll just quickly finish. And on that matter, wanted to meet with relevant organisations for a discussion around that issue and safety issues.
And we know that after the meeting, foil wasn't banned, but plastic staples, as opposed, sorry,
That's right.
metal fasteners were banned,
Yes,
thereby using plastic staples.
that's right.
But in making that decision, did you go back and consider that the industry or the organisations referred to in this minute said the risks associated with foil are proportionally no more significant, provided that all appropriate safety measures are taken, and what they were? That is, was simply replacing metal staples with plastic staples enough, or did you have to do something else?
Well, I think the answer to that question is that added to which were the additional communications that had been given to installers by way of advisories and the publicity around this issue as well, the interaction between the department and stakeholders, including the industry. Some of these industry associations had their own training provisions. Some of these industry companies had their own training underway, and they made up a fair bulk of the insulation product that was going into the roof. So the sum total of all of that is to say clearly this is something that everybody had at front of mind, and it was the subject of serious consideration.
We know, and I suspect you knew at the time, that foil was about 5% of the total number of insulation installations that were taking place under the program. And of those, presumably a number weren't horizontally laid across the ceiling joists. I'm just trying to come to grips with why don't just stop using foil. Yes, they're going to be upset people, but if safety is paramount, why not just stop it?
Well, as you know, we ultimately did take that.
Not till only a couple of days before the program was stopped.
No, but you've got the benefit of the wisdom of hindsight to know when the program was stopped. It wasn't necessarily the case that it would have been then, although it was my recommendation that it should be at that time. I went through what I thought were the appropriate processes of consultation with the industry, mindful that this was a serious issue and that my department was recommending something that I wasn't accepting, and I was seeking to be clear about it, get appropriate levels of information so I could make a determined decision, which I ultimately did.
I'll take you then to 148 of your statement. You knew on the 23rd of October, pick it up, that the Queensland regulators were increasingly worried about foil generally. I'm just wondering how Mr. Keefe explained that to you. The last line and a bit of 148.
I think this has been extracted, Council, by way of reference to Mr. Levy's statements at the time.
Yes.
Although it was an issue that was being raised.
Yes. But do you have any recollection other than what's written there? Did Mr. Keefe explain why Queensland regulators were increasingly worried?
No, I don't.
At the meeting on the 27th of October, which is referenced in your statement at 151, do you recall Mr. Richards advocating the suspension of foil from the program?
I'm referring to my statement in order to answer that question. So I don't specifically remember. Well, I had quite a bit. We had interactions with Mr. Richards, as you can see from the statement.
Subparagraph D on page 37 might help you.
Oh, there it is, yeah.
So do you recall Mr. Richards expressing that view?
Yes.
Was he a lone voice, or did others also express the same or similar views?
There wasn't unanimity of views around this issue there, and that's reflected in part in the brief.
Yes. Do you recall who else was expressing the view that foil should be suspended or banned under the program?
No, I don't. We have my statement here by way of reference, which identifies what the brief extracted from the meeting.
Yes.
As by way of record.
Yes. Could I take you then to 153 of your statement? And this is a change, seeking your approval to change the guidelines and to exhibit PG 68. Which is AGS 002-013-1712. My query here is, if we go to the briefing document, which is dated the 22nd of October, you'll see under the background document, it refers to the meeting on the 27th of October. And if we go to the heading Foil Products and Fasteners, you with me?
Yes, I am.
There seems to be a discussion in the second circle point that there's more than one type of foil product that's being referred to. Do you recall that discussion at the meeting on the 27th of October?
I do recall that there was a discussion, but not the detail.
That it wasn't necessary to ban foil per se, but perhaps only the sheet foil that was rolled out across ceiling joists, whilst maintaining the right to use the foil bats, as it were. Do you recall that sort of discussion?
Well, I can recall that there were a variety of views in the discussion around foil generally. The specifics of that discussion, no, I don't recall.
Paragraph 157 of your statement refers to a discussion that you had with the Prime Minister, but I wanted to ask you about the last sentence.
I think 157 refers actually to the correspondence, which
Yes.
addresses the question of consultation, Council.
Oh, yes, you're
Not
quite right.
Specific discussion.
Yes. And you were advocating for certain steps or certain measures to be put in place. That's the case, isn't it?
Are you referring to 157?
Yes. But in turn, it refers back to some correspondence, as you rightly reminded me, in 154 and 154.
That's right.
But the query I had was again about the last sentence of 157, where you said this was not the objective of the HIP, but became a necessary focus to address safety concerns. Do I correctly conclude from that that until events happened on 14 October and subsequently, it was not the objective of the HIP to burden industry with regulation or other impositions that they were required to comply with?
Well, that's part of a broader discussion, and the Commissioner will consider this. The Commonwealth didn't have any regulatory powers per se, and that was the advice, of course, that
Turn off the tap.
came to ministers.
It could turn off the tap, though, couldn't it?
Well, yes, it could, but I think the point that's being made here is simply that there was an issue that had arisen in discussions with industry, and it was general conversation about, well, if you keep on applying a regulatory framework, then there's that much regulation around, and there was a view, including from within parts of the APS, that a light touch was preferable.
Yes. So I take you then to 168 and PG 81, which for the record is QIC 006 001 1812.
Encapsulate your view. Once told by the Prime Minister it would commence on the 1st of July, what you expected your department to do is do its best to deliver on that commitment by the Prime Minister.
That's what it says.
And that was your view.
That's right.
That is, Mr Wilson also raised the word with you that the 1st of July date was immutable, and a lot of people have come along and said that. Was that your view as well? That is, the 1st of July date was essentially immovable, and what your department and you should do was their best to ensure that the program in one guise or another commenced on the 1st of July?
Well, the actual 1st of July commencement date was not an issue that was drawn to my attention by way of formal briefs or otherwise.
Of course not, but the Prime-Minister had made a commitment to that effect. And from reading your paragraph, thereafter you expected your department to achieve it so that the program in one form or another would commence on the date that the Prime Minister had committed to.
Well, the sentence is clear, to the best of its capacity and ability, and on the basis of advice that came to me at that time, there was no advice that came to me that said they wouldn't be able to deliver it on that start point at that date.
Can we go to Annexure 87 of your statement, please? Oh, sorry. FUL 002.001.0392. This is a letter from you to Kevin Fuller, obviously in November after the death of his son Matthew. December this when you sent it, correct? See the second paragraph? I was very saddened. Go to the second line of it, will you?
I beg your pardon?
Go to the second line of the second paragraph. You want to assure Mr. Fuller that safety is an absolute priority. Do you see that assertion? Sorry, if you agree, would you say so? The transcript can't pick up a nod, you see, okay?
I can see that sentence.
The only absolute priority in all of this program was its start date on the 1st of July, wasn't it?
Well, I think that I've already answered that question.
Well, help me out and answer it, would you? The only absolute priority was the start date
Commissioner,
of the 1st of July.
You might remind Council, in my respectful submission, that notwithstanding the Evidence Act requirements don't apply in a proceeding like this, that the proscriptions there on offensive questions are appropriate in any quasi-curial setting. And
A response
Mr. Perry, he has answered that question to you already.
oh, you can't see me on my feet.
Now, Mr. Garrett, go to the document that prompted this, which is Exhibit 86, FUL 002.001.0398. That's the letter from Mr. Fuller to you. You got that?
It hasn't come up yet.
All right. You've got your statement beside you if it helps to go to the...
Are you referring to the letter that we have on the screen in front of us?
No, that's still yours, I think.
That's mine.
From Mr. Fuller to you that prompted the next letter. Now we're getting there. There you go. Now down towards the bottom of it. A little bit further. Thank you. You see the paragraph in the hierarchy of control for hazards?
Yes.
What Mr. Fuller was telling you is, and it's in caps and bold here and there, that elimination is the first measure of control of a hazard and risk. Correct?
I can see what he's saying in that sense. Yeah.
Was that your understanding of how OH&S procedures generally ran? That the first step in trying to provide a safe workplace or work environment is, where possible, to eliminate a hazard or a risk?
There are different occupational health and safety regulations that apply in different states. And in respect of the Queensland occupational health and safety regulations, if that was included in them, and that would be my expectation or something to that effect.
Well, what I asked you about is something that's a little more general. In terms of OH&S principles generally, would you accept that it was your state of mind that the first thing that one might do is eliminate, if possible or practicable, a hazard or a risk?
Yes.
Now, the witness then please go to AGS 002.017.2244. This is a series of emails.
What annexure?
AGS 002.017.
Well, on what capacity does the witness have to bring that up? You are the operator or the witness? You said witness bring it up.
Oh, really?
Oh, really?
It has been the practice over 6 weeks before Mr. Whitlam turned up to preface it on this way. Can the witness be shown, or will the witness go? It's been Kaminsky to Speransky, 22nd October, 12:36 p.m. All right? Now, what's happened is that Ms. Kaminsky has asked Mr. Speransky some questions, and then Mr. Speransky has responded in the same document, hence the different typeface. Now, 22nd October is, of course, prior to the date that you made the decision ultimately a little later in October not to ban FOIL. Right? Now, just generally speaking, were you made aware of these emails before you made that decision later in October not to ban FOIL?
No.
Go to that one which should be in front of you. Question, is FOIL banned? Do you see that question?
Yes.
Right. Now that's Ms. Kaminsky's question to Speransky. About 4 or 5 lines down, please note that this was not written deliberately. Now to put it in context, read that first paragraph to yourself, so if this had never been brought to your attention, you should. Done? Thank you. You see the sentence, please note that this was not written deliberately against reflective membranes or any other products for that matter. Then this assertion, hearing it would appear what they tried in New Zealand, we just aimed for the best value for taxpayers' money, which equates to high performance, durability and minimal safety risks. I know you've been asked a number of hypothetical questions, but to some extent, as you hadn't seen these documents before you made the decision on later in October, I need to ask it this way. Firstly, would that approach, which Mr. Speransky says reflected the New Zealand approach, namely what they tried to do was best value for taxpayers' money, which equates to high performance, durability and minimal safety risk. Do you think that that would, from your perspective as Minister, describe how you thought your program should proceed as well?
Well, look, I don't know this official and I've never cited this email before.
I know, I understand.
That being the case, I wouldn't add anything other than to the answers I've already given to council that I think have provided a context of the question that you've put.
Then further down that page, you'll see another heading from Ms. Kaminsky. Was the issue of metal versus plastic staples raised? See that question?
Yes.
Read the response to yourself and down to just before the next question, was a partial ban considered? It's a relatively short paragraph. Now, what Mr. Speransky is asserting is that they didn't pick up on plastic staples as was done here later in October, because they didn't think that plastic staples would completely eliminate safety risks. Do you see that sentence? You weren't provided with these emails before you made your decision.
That's correct.
Is it also the case that you haven't seen it until I brought it up with you now?
That's correct.
Right. Then, bearing in mind the time, I might give you an opportunity to think about them overnight and to read it, as this seems to reflect what they did in New Zealand. But would you accept that after Matthew Fuller's death, an appropriate course would have been to take steps which, as the New Zealanders described, would completely eliminate safety risks and thereby not use plastic staples?
I consider that the steps that I took subsequent to Matthew's death, on the basis of the advice that I sought urgently and that was provided to me after consultation with the industry, was the appropriate advice, given that, to qualify a part of your question, I didn't accept the advice of my department not to do certain things, but rather determined upon receiving that advice that I would do certain things, and they were things that were aimed at increasing safety. I did them in a deliberated fashion over time on the basis of advice that I received, and coming to the view sometimes that the advice that I received was not sufficiently persuasive. I basically dissented from my department and took the steps anyway.
Ultimately, you made the decision to allow plastic staples in lieu of metal fasteners, though, didn't you?
That's correct.
Go to paragraph 153 of your statement. It would appear, if you go about 4 lines from the bottom, do you see the sentence commencing, however, plastic staples?
Yes.
Now, the advice, I take it, which is what you're summarising here, is that plastic staples are likely to reduce electrical risk due to their lower conductivity. See that? That was your advice?
That's correct.
The New Zealand view appeared to be that they didn't want to use plastic staples because to do so would not completely eliminate safety risks. Lower conductivity and an assertion merely that plastic staples are likely to reduce electrical risk doesn't equate with eliminating risk, does it?
Well, I don't think risk is eliminated in any of the regulatory approaches that are applied to this or to other activities, but to the extent that the advice I received indicated things that would reduce risk, then I was willing to insist that they be put into place.
What you were told, it would appear, firstly, is that plastic staples are likely to reduce risk, but that plastic staples obviously have a level of conductivity because the comparison is one is lower than the other. Did you consider that the lower conductivity of plastic staples being likely to reduce electrical risk was a sufficient response to the death of Matthew Fuller?
Well, that brief includes recommendations or otherwise for a number of things for me to consider and act on, which I did. And on that basis, I did consider that that was the right response to Matthew's death.
But you would have, in considering it and approving it have understood that the best that your use of plastic staples could achieve, according to your own advice, was no more than a likelihood of a reduction of electrical risk due to lower conductivity?
Well, if I can put my answer to you this way, there were a number of different issues that related to safety that we're focused on at this point in time. The other one, other than foil on the roof across the joists, was the question of mandating downlight covers. Again, that was a matter which there wasn't unanimous agreement, and there were degrees that were identified of, to the extent to which that would make these matters safe, and I provided an exemption from some material that was fire retardant. So I think, to the best extent possible, with the advice in front of me, bearing in mind sometimes that there wasn't always agreement about technical issues around the advice, I made decisions about those things which I believed would contribute to safety in the future. And if I hadn't made a decision about a certain matter at that time, it was because I was seeking further advice. I wanted to speak to the industry again and see whether some coherent views emerged. If they didn't, then I'd look at that and then make an additional decision if I felt it was appropriate. And I went that way right through to the conclusion of the program.
Just want to concentrate on foil and staples for the moment, if you would. Being advised that the best that plastic staples would do would be a likelihood of reducing risk due to lower conductivity, did you have cause to ask anyone whether anything could be done to eliminate a risk or to improve the reduction in risk? Or did you proceed upon the basis that that which you had been advised was really the only viable alternative?
Well, the brief identifies the banning of metal fasteners as a way of reducing the risk, and on that basis I agreed to mandate the banning of metal fasteners.
Yep. You agreed with me earlier that one of the general principles underlying OH&S is where practical to eliminate risk. If that is the appropriate approach, and it is obviously, did it occur to you to ask anyone whether that level of safety could be achieved? And if so, how, obviously?
Well, Councillor, with respect, you've paraphrased what I said to you previously, but I'm sure people will have heard that. The answer to your question is there was a great deal of interrogation of officials and the industry as to what the appropriate actions ought to be taken as a consequence of Matthew's death. I listened very carefully to what people said to me, looked at the advice that I received, and then made the decision that I could on the basis that I hoped it would improve safety.
Notwithstanding that great deal of interrogation, as you would say, it would appear that the information supplied by the ECA man in New Zealand to Ms Kaminsky in your department on the 22nd of October was not provided to you.
I've already confirmed that.
Now, can I ask you about the audit program, please? Mr Wilson asked you some questions about it. Can the witness be shown that AGS 002.020.0322, what will be brought... No, it's not a text of your statement. What will be brought up is a thing called a Gantt chart, which is a program chart of the process obtained from your department at different dates reflecting where things stood. All right? Now, the one you should have, and to be kind to you and to me, if you struggle with reading it, just say so and we can try and blow it up. Will you move to the right, please? Keep going. We've got the correct one. Keep going. Right. You see the top right-hand corner there, project status as at Wednesday, 12th August. Got that? Right. Slip back to the left. Down. Here. You'll see a heading Mainstream Audit Program. Yep, just about got there, a bit further. Right. Now, before the next heading, which is External Communications, you will see under Mainstream Audit Program, as at the 12th of August, that a number of things have not even commenced. Auditor Logistic Planning, this is now working up. Chief Project Auditor appointed, contract negotiations, and evaluate order tender response. Do you see those?
I do.
I read it. Each of those four are shown at 0%, and will be completed at different dates, but certainly no earlier than the middle of September down to the end of September. Right? Yeah. Then will you go to the next page of this thing? Keep going, you'll see a heading, Installation, Audit and Compliance. Up a bit.
Oops, gone too far.
That's it. Now, you'll see under that heading, a subheading, Interim Audit, Compliance and Capability. Perhaps not surprising, as at the 12th of August, because of those 0% numbers in respect of mainstream audit. Now, interim. Go down to, you see desktop audits phase 1. And that's for the pre-1st July. Go across, that's about 29%. Next one under it, desktop audits phase 2, 29. And then equivalent figures for the mainstream audit that we saw on the previous page. Right? That seems to be, from your department's perspective, the state of the audit compliance regime as at the 12th of August. Right?
Yes.
Now, were you kept aware of things like the development of the mainstream, or the development of the audit and compliance regime as to how it was rolling out and what stage it had ever reached?
To the extent that you can see identified in my statement and in the specific briefs that deal with those matters.
Okay. Will the witness please be shown MIS.002.001.0224. This is, as it gets up, the transcript of an interview with the well-known Ray Hadley down in Sydney and some calls being viewed in August. Okay. If you go to what should be the 3rd page of it. Now, right at the bottom of the 2nd page, just go up a bit to the 2nd page. There, you see, I do know Ray, that's the bottom of the 2nd page, it's you. All right, and then you'll see on the next page, the 2nd paragraph. We've got a comprehensive compliance program in place. This is the 4th of August. I'm assuming, of course, that before making such a statement, you proceeded upon the basis that someone had told you what the status was.
Yes.
One did not engage in hyperbole or anything like that.
Well, not so much the status, but what's included in the briefs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you recall being advised, before you went to see or talk to Mr. Hadley, what the state of the compliance program was?
To the extent that there was additional advice coming through to me in respect of compliance, it would only be that advice that's contained in the briefs and whatever was extracted from the briefs.
All right. Can you now, having had the opportunity to see from the Gantt charts what the true status of the compliance and audit regime was as of the 12th of August, that is 8 days after you were speaking to Mr. Hadley, can you tell the Commission whether you accept, firstly, that that which the Gantt chart reveals does not contemplate at all a comprehensive compliance program in place, and secondly, if it be the case, why it would be that you made such an assertion to Hadley when the department's own documents do rather tend to indicate something different?
Well, the compliance and audit program, as you know, was a program which continued to be rolled out through the life of HIP. And it was audit and compliance. I'd sought briefs on audit and compliance and I'd received those briefs, so clearly I was aware that audit and compliance was underway. I've never seen this Gantt chart before. I wasn't aware of its existence specifically, and I'm not aware of whether there are other iterations of the chart, whether this is the matters that have been identified that you pointed out to me, Council. There are other matters which require emphasis or otherwise. I can say that the challenge of audit and compliance was a real one for the department, and I think that's clear. It comes through in the briefs that have been presented to me. I was aware of that, which is why I sought updates, and when I noted those updates, I responded where I thought it was appropriate.
Would you accept that that which is revealed in the Gantt chart, and like you, we can only proceed on the information provided by your department to this commission. But to accept it based upon that Gantt chart that I showed you, that as at 12th of August, the audit and compliance program was in its infancy.
I don't know whether I would use the word its infancy. I think there are different components of the program, but I certainly can see from what you're showing me that there are certain aspects of that program that hadn't started.
Some hadn't started, and even the desktop audits, proposed 1 and 2, were shown on the chart as being at no more than 29%. That would rather tend to indicate that as at the 12th of August, that is about 6 weeks after this program had started, the audit and compliance component of it was nowhere near developed.
And I think it was clearly going to be the case that it would require further resources, further application, and to be beefed up over time. And I'm pretty sure that at a much later date, when I say much later in terms of the program unfolding, after Matthew's death, when we came back to focus on compliance, that it was a matter which I was particularly alert to.
Compliance, however, and the effectiveness of it, which is itself dependent upon the extent to which it is implemented, was a central part of the program whereby installer safety might be addressed with you.
Well, this question's already been put to me in another form by council assisting, but certainly compliance is a part of the program, that's correct.
But it was more than just a part, it was the means whereby whether or not safe work practices were actually being undertaken under the program after it commenced on the 1st of July could be ascertained so that steps could be taken to address issues before, for example, a death occurred.
Well, I think the purposes of the compliance program was to make sure that the program was being delivered according to its terms and conditions, and the safety conditions that you're focusing on properly were part of that. I think that, well, I don't think, I know that the capacity for the department to sufficiently audit a wide range of activities that were underway in terms of the volume of numbers, because the size of the program was an issue that they would have to manage. But the early briefs to me and advice on compliance showed relatively high levels of compliance. And it was only towards the middle and then latter stages that we start to see lower levels of compliance emerging.
But the early reports on compliance can hardly in any sense have been comprehensive or representative if, as would appear from this Gantt chart, the compliance program itself had either not commenced at all in many respects or, in terms of interim compliance, had only achieved a relatively low percentage of development.
Well, my expectation as Minister would be that the compliance framework that the department had put to me for delivery would be delivered.
And delivered, though, surely firstly prior to the commencement of the rollout, so there was in place an effective compliance regime on and from the date the program commenced.
Well, I understand the point that you're referring to. It was important for the department to put in place compliance measures as soon as they could.
And in terms of the connection between the compliance program and safety, the longer the program went on without an effective compliance program, the greater the risk to safety.
Well, I don't propose to debate with you these issues. I'm not sure what the time constraints are for us, but I guess what I would say in response to your question is that clearly compliance was a necessary part of this program. And you've pointed out to me information and communications from a New Zealand bureaucrat or whoever it might be to my department, which I haven't seen, and you've put a Gantt chart in front of me that I haven't seen either. What I can say is that it was my expectation that the audit and compliance process, as proposed and advised to me, would be conducted by the department. If it wasn't as thorough as it could be expected to be, I would expect to be advised of that, and I would make an appropriate decision in respect of it.
Yeah.
Convenient times.
One question, if I might. Indeed, just to wrap it up, indeed quite proper that your recollection is that the state of the compliance program, which that Gantt chart tends to reveal, was not something that was brought to your attention.
That's correct.
Yes, Mr. Wilson.
Commissioner, can I invite you to start at 9 in the morning?
Yes.
And could I invite you to ask for a roll call so we can let the next witness know whether he's required before lunch?
Right. How long, Mr. Perry, how long do you envisage being?
Half an hour to 45 minutes.
All right, I'm going to say 45. Mr.
Hey, Commissioner,
I'm
about
sorry, I'd
20
forgotten.
minutes, you all right?
Yep, sorry.
20 minutes, Commissioner?
20 minutes plus or minus, Commissioner.
I might be an hour and a half, Commissioner. I might be an hour and a half.
Yes.
I would expect to be about 10 minutes, Commissioner.
No more than 5 minutes.
10 minutes, Commissioner.
10 minutes.
Well, on what I've heard so far, not very long at all, but there's some threats there.
Thank you, Mr. Howard.
I don't expect to be very long, but it's always possible that there'll be some questioning that arises out of the near 2 hours to 2.5 hours of questioning.
Well, say if we're up to 225 minutes, it's getting on.
So
So
we
I
should-
allow a degree of exaggeration, that's 4 hours.
We should be safe to tell the next witness not before 2:15.
Not before 2:15, yes.
Thank you.
And will that be Mr. Rudd, or have we had to rearrange things? And what about the person, the family that wanted to come at 9? Is that the next day?
I think that was on Thursday morning, wasn't it?
Thursday morning.
Thursday.
And we're going to seek to interpose.
Yeah, well, you sort that out with Mr. Wilson.
Yes.
So we start at 9 tomorrow, and the Mr. Rudd not before 2:15. Thank you.